She knelt on cold stone in front of 1,000 witnesses and begged the most powerful alpha alive to believe her. He looked down at the woman who would have died for him and chose his pride instead. What happened next broke her completely. But what she became afterward, that destroyed him. This is the story of a king who had everything, threw it away with both hands, and spent the rest of his life paying for it. Stay until the end. Drop your city in the comments. I want to know where my pack is watching from tonight. The Great Hall of Silver Fang Keep had seen executions, coronations, and wars declared over goblets of wine. Its stone walls were older than anyone's grandfather, black with torch smoke and soaked through with the kind of history that made lesser men feel small just standing inside it. Mounted wolf skulls lined the upper gallery. Enemies, challengers, pack traders, each one a story that ended the same way. The floor was pale granite worn smooth by centuries of boots, and tonight every inch of it was packed with bodies. Nobles, pack lords, sword-sworn captains who had ridden into battle under the silver wolf banner, merchants wealthy enough to buy a seat near the front, servants pressed into the shadows along the walls, eyes wide, mouths shut. Word had traveled fast through the keep that afternoon, the way bad news always did, quiet and quick, spreading from ear to ear until the whole fortress was humming with it. Something had happened to the king's mate. Something had been discovered. Nobody knew the full shape of it yet, but everyone had come to watch the king decide what to do with the truth. Cale Thornheart stood at the far end of the hall on the raised dais where his father had stood and his grandfather before that. He was 31 years old and had been Alpha King since he was 23, had killed his first challenger at 16 with his bare hands in a mountain pass during a blizzard, and in the 8 years since his coronation had not once been seen to hesitate in public. He was not a tall man by Alpha standards. Riker Draven had 2 inches on him, as Kyle would eventually learn to his cost. But he was built like something carved out of necessity rather than comfort. Wide through the shoulders, lean everywhere else, with the kind of hands that had calluses in places that told a story without words. His face was angular and hard, the jaw carrying a few days of dark stubble, and his eyes were the specific gray of a winter sky that has decided it's going to snow and is no longer interested in debate. He wore his formal coat tonight, deep charcoal, silver wolf head clasp at the shoulder, but he'd left the collar open and hadn't bothered with the ceremonial sword. The sword would have felt like theater. What was about to happen was not theater. Nira Vale stood at the center of the hall, and the space around her was a circle of pure exposure. The crowd had pulled back instinctively, the way crowds do when they sense something is about to happen that they'll want to describe to their grandchildren. She was 26, built slender but not fragile, with dark hair she usually kept braided and dark eyes that on most days carried a calm intelligence in them that had unsettled more than one person who'd made the mistake of underestimating her. Tonight her hair was loose, and there was nothing calm in her eyes. She had been brought from her chambers without warning 20 minutes ago. She was wearing the pale dress she'd been in all afternoon. No jewelry, no rank insignia, nothing that marked her as the King Alpha's mate except the simple silver cord around her left wrist that every bonded mate of Silver Fang Keep wore. She'd had time to understand that something was wrong before the guards reached her door. She hadn't had time to understand how wrong. She understood it now. Senna Aldravane stood to the left of the dais, and if Naira had looked at her in that moment, she would have seen the very particular expression of a woman who had spent 3 months constructing something and was now watching it execute. Senna was 34, high-born, with the kind of beauty that had opened doors her entire life and the kind of intelligence that had learned to hide itself behind that beauty. She was wearing a deep burgundy gown, which Naira would later remember as the color of old blood, and her hands were folded in front of her with a stillness that looked like grief, but wasn't. Lord Castor Aldravane, Senna's uncle, and one of the most influential pack lords in the kingdom, stood a half step behind her. He was watching Kyle, not Naira. He had the look of a man waiting for a door to swing open. The hall was almost completely quiet, just the creak of the torches in their iron brackets, the distant sound of wind against stone. Kyle's voice, when it came, was very controlled. "You know why you're here." It wasn't a question. Nira looked up at him and her jaw was tight. "No," she said. "I don't. Your guards wouldn't tell me. Nobody would tell me anything. Senna, Kael said the name without looking away from Naira. Tell her what you told me. Senna stepped forward with perfectly calibrated reluctance, like a woman performing an act of terrible courage. I saw you, she said, her voice carrying the soft break of someone choosing honesty over self-interest. 3 weeks ago, in the Eastern Corridor, past the archive, you and Captain Varan. You handed him a document pouch. He handed you a coin seal I recognized. It was the Blackthorn Compact's mark, a rival trading house. I didn't want to believe what I was seeing. I waited. I watched. Last week I went to the king because I couldn't stay silent anymore. The hall went very still. Nera stared at Senna. The thing happening inside her in that moment was not fear exactly. It was the specific sensation of realizing the ground you're standing on was not solid, had never been solid, and you just didn't know it. Her mouth opened and then closed. That didn't happen, she said. Naira? Kael's voice had an edge to it. That didn't happen. Her eyes came back to him, and now there was something sharper in them. Kael, I have never been in the Eastern Corridor past the archive after dark. You know I don't go to that part of the keep. You know, we found the seal in your quarters, Kael said. The silence that followed was different in quality from the one before it. Nera went still. Not the stillness of guilt. She was not someone who had ever been good at performing emotion she didn't feel, and she was not performing anything now, but the stillness of a person whose mind is running very fast through a sequence of realizations that all point toward the same cliff edge. You searched my quarters, she said. I had to. You searched my quarters. She said it again, not as a question, but as something she was pressing against to test its weight. When? This afternoon. And you found... She stopped. Something had moved through her face, a flash of understanding that was also a flash of devastation. Kael. Her voice had gone very quiet. Kael, someone put that there. Think about what you're doing. Think about who... Don't. The single syllable from him landed like a stone. Don't stand in front of my entire court and tell me someone planted evidence against you. Don't do that. Then what am I supposed to do? Her voice cracked on the last word, just slightly, and she visibly steadied herself. What am I supposed to say? I'm standing here being told I did something I did not do, with no warning, no time to... Senna has no reason to lie. The words hit her like a physical blow. Nera saw it. Everyone in the hall saw it. The way her whole frame absorbed the sentence. Her eyes went to Senna for just a moment, and whatever she saw there, she filed it away somewhere behind her teeth, because she turned back to Kael without saying it. And I have no reason to betray you, she said. Very flat. Very clear. I have never had any reason. Everything I had, everything I was, I gave to you and to this pack. You know that. You have always known that. I thought I did. And the terrible thing, the thing that would live in Nera's memory for years afterward, was that he sounded tired more than angry. Like a man who had spent the afternoon deciding something and was done with the deciding. I thought a lot of things. Look at me. She stepped forward, and one of the guards near the dais shifted, but she ignored him. She looked up at Kael on his raised platform, and her chin was up and her eyes were burning. Look at me, and tell me you believe this. He looked at her. And in that look was everything she had ever feared about the man she loved. The way his certainty closed over him like armor. The way once he'd decided something, it became the shape of reality itself. The way his pride and his grief and his inability to be wrong in front of witnesses were all the same thing, wearing different coats. I believe what I can prove, he said. Something went out of Nera's eyes. Not the light exactly. Something structural, like a beam being pulled from a wall. Kael, his name came out of her like something breaking loose. Please, don't. His voice roughened, just slightly, just enough to tell her what it was costing him, which somehow made it worse. Don't make this harder. Hard? The word came out of her with sudden fury, a flash of raw heat. You think this is hard for you? I am standing in front of your entire court accused of something I didn't do, and you're looking at me like I'm already gone. You haven't even asked me. You searched my room and you listened to... She stopped herself, breathing hard through her nose, and when she spoke again, the fury had collapsed back into something rawer and more terrible. You haven't even asked me. As if you already knew. The evidence? Tell me what I told you, she said, and her voice had gone to a whisper that somehow carried through the entire hall. When I came to you 4 months ago, tell me what I said about Lord Castor. Tell me what I noticed about the eastern border ledgers. Tell me what I warned you about. The air in the hall shifted, just slightly. Several of the more attentive nobles glanced at Castor Aldrovane, who did not change his expression at all. Kale's jaw tightened. Naira, tell me. The word was a plea and a demand at the same time. Something passed through his face. Whether it was doubt or the refusal of doubt, it moved too quickly to read. And then his expression settled back into the shape it had been carrying all evening. Flat, resolved, the face of a king who had already made his decision. It doesn't matter, he said. That was the sentence that destroyed her. Not the banishment that came after it, not the stripping of her title, not the cold formal language he used to do it. That sentence. 3 words. It doesn't matter. Because what it meant, what it really meant, was that he had never fully known her, or had known her and chosen not to trust that knowledge, which was worse. She went to her knees. She did not plan it, and she was not performing it. Her legs simply stopped holding her with the same casual finality as a rope that has been cut. The cold stone came up hard against her knees, and the skirt of her pale dress spread around her, and the entire hall made a low sound, a collective inhale, and then went absolutely silent. Please. She didn't look down. She kept her eyes on him. Kael, please. Whatever doubt you have, whatever I have to do, whatever proof you need me to find, I will find it. I will do anything. Just don't do this. Don't throw away what we are over something that isn't true. He stood above her on his dais, and his hands were very still at his sides, and his face was the face of a man who was taking something apart inside himself and locking the pieces in separate rooms and losing the keys to all of them. You'll be escorted to the northern border by nightfall tomorrow, he said. Your title is forfeit. The mate cord will be removed before you leave. You won't come back. The silence afterward was a living thing. Naira's hands were flat against her thighs. Her eyes stayed on him for a long moment, and the thing he would see in his sleep for years afterward was the specific way her expression finished changing. Not into anger, not into hatred, but into something that looked almost like comprehension, like a woman who has just understood something about the nature of a person she loved, something true and irreversible, and is adjusting her entire understanding of the world around that new fact. She stood up. She did it without wobbling and without looking down. She straightened the front of her dress with one precise movement, and then she looked at Senna Aldrovane, just for a moment, just one single look. And whatever was in that look made 3 people near Senna step back slightly without being aware they were doing it. Then she turned and walked toward the side corridor, and a guard fell in beside her, and the crowd parted, and Naira Vale walked out of the Silver Fang Great Hall and did not look back. Kael watched her go. He kept his spine straight, and his face controlled and his hands still at his sides. And he watched the door close behind her, and he told himself that justice had been served, and that a king who could be manipulated by sentiment was a king already defeated. He was very good at telling himself things. In the shadows near the far wall, a servant girl named Peta, who had been pressed against the stone trying to make herself invisible, watched the Lady Naira's back disappear through the doorway and felt something go wrong in the room, something large and quiet and permanent, like a foundation crack that won't show itself for years. Senna Aldrovane exhaled slowly through parted lips, and her hands, very briefly, unclenched. That night the wind came down hard from the north and rattled every shutter in the keep, and Kael sat alone in his study with a fire going and a cup of something untouched in his hand, and he did not think about Naira. He was very deliberate about not thinking about her. He thought about the seal instead, the small bronze disc with the Blackthorn Compact's mark, which his captain of guards had brought to him wrapped in cloth like something dangerous. He thought about Senna's face when she'd come to him that afternoon, the performance of reluctance she'd given, the way she'd said, "I don't want to believe it," before laying out everything she'd supposedly seen. He had believed her because it had never occurred to him not to, because Senna had no motive, because the evidence was physical, because Naira had mentioned Castor Aldrovane to him 4 months ago, and at the time he'd half listened, distracted by a border dispute, and had filed it away as mate politics, the kind of interpersonal current that ran beneath every court and rarely amounted to anything serious. He picked up the cup and set it down again without drinking. Outside his window, the northern wilderness began about 2 leagues past the keep's outer wall. He knew the terrain, had hunted it, had tracked men through it, had slept rough in it twice during his early years as Alpha. It was not a kind landscape, rocky, exposed, the kind of cold at night in this season that got into your bones and started working on your will before it worked on your body. He stood up and walked to the window and stood there with one hand on the stone frame and looked out at nothing. He was still standing there when the first gray light came in. She was gone before noon. He didn't watch her leave. He told himself that was mercy. There was nothing to be gained by a second scene, nothing useful in prolonging it. He had a kingdom to run and a court that was watching to see whether the Silver Fang Alpha could make a hard decision and stand behind it. He held 3 meetings that morning and was sharp and present in all of them, and nobody who looked at his face would have known that anything was wrong. Captain Davin Marsh came to him just before midday and said, quietly and without drama, that the Lady Nyra had been escorted to the northern road and that she had not spoken to anyone during the escort and that she had refused the horse they'd offered her and walked. She walked, Kael said. Yes, my lord. He looked at his desk. Fine, he said. Dismissed. He sat down and stared at the map spread across his desk, border territories, trade routes, pack holdings, and the lines of it blurred slightly and then sharpened again. He picked up a quill and drew a single deliberate mark on a supply route notation, and that was that. Niravale was no longer his concern. 4 months passed. The Silver Fang Kingdom was not a peaceful place in those 4 months. It was not, to be fair, a peaceful place in any 4-month stretch of its history, but these particular months had a specific texture to them that Kael felt but couldn't name. A restlessness, a looseness in the machinery that shouldn't have been there. 2 pack lords who had always been reliable started making delayed responses to Crown Communications. A merchant consortium that had been paying tribute comfortably for 6 years suddenly had questions about the rates. 2 separate skirmishes broke out along the eastern border. Nothing large, nothing that couldn't be managed, but the pattern of them was odd. They came from places that hadn't been friction points before. Kael handled each thing as it appeared. That was what he did. He was very good at putting out fires individually. He was less good at standing back far enough to see that the fires had started forming a shape. The diplomatic summit in Greyveal was Lord Castor Aldrevain's suggestion, proposed 3 months after Nyra's banishment with the stated purpose of establishing new trade agreements with 4 neighboring pack territories. Kael agreed to attend. It was good politics. The Silver Fang Kingdom's eastern relationships had been fraying, and face-to-face meetings mattered. He didn't think about the fact that the fraying had started almost exactly 4 months ago. He didn't think about what Nyra had told him about the eastern border ledgers. He told himself he didn't think about it. That was slightly different, but he was doing that with a lot of things. Greyveal was a neutral city, technically under no single pack's jurisdiction, governed by a merchant council that had survived 3 centuries of surrounding political upheaval by being aggressively useful to every side and loyal to none. The summit hall was in the central district, a wide stone building with high ceilings and large fireplaces and long tables that could seat 200. By the time Kael arrived with his delegation, 12 personal guard, 3 senior advisors, Lord Castor and Senna among the official party, the hall was already half full. He recognized most of the delegations: the Ember Ridge Pact to the southeast, the Coldwater Confederation, the Greywood Alliance, the Iron Seat Pack from the far eastern mountains. He'd dealt with all of them in various configurations over the years. He knew their politics, their pressure points, their histories. What he didn't know was the delegation that arrived 40 minutes after his own. He heard the shift in the room before he saw the cause of it. Sound changed, not louder but more concentrated, the way sound gets when a large number of people simultaneously change what they're paying attention to. He looked up from his conversation with the Ember Ridge Alpha Lord. The Black Wolf delegation came through the main doors without theater, which was itself a kind of theater. 4 guards in front, 4 behind, wearing dark leather and carrying themselves with the specific economy of movement that came from actual combat experience rather than ceremonial training. Between them walked Riker Draven. Kael had never met Riker Draven. He'd heard about him the way you heard about natural disasters, as a fact of geography, as something that existed in the territory north and east of your own, dangerous in the abstract but not immediately your problem. Riker had united 3 hostile Northern Pact territories in 5 years, which was either politics or war, depending on how you told the story, and the answer was probably both. He was 33, the rumors said, and had fought his first real battle at 15 and hadn't stopped. Looking at him now, Kyle revised some of his mental picture. Riker was larger than he'd expected, not ostentatiously large, not the kind of size that advertised itself, but the kind that registered as a physical fact the way a cliff face registered, something you measured yourself against without meaning to. Dark hair, uncut, pulled back, a scar along his jaw that had healed wrong and left a slight ridge. His face was not a kind face, but it was not a cruel one either. It was a face that had been paying attention for a very long time. He was wearing black without insignia, which in this room full of men wearing their pack colors and rank markers was a statement that said, quietly and without raising its voice, "I don't need any of that." Kyle looked at him for 3 seconds and understood that this was a man he would have to be careful with. And then Riker moved slightly to his left, and Kyle saw who was walking beside him. The first thing he noticed was that she was wearing deep green, a close-fitted jacket, riding trousers, boots that had actual mud on them rather than the polished ceremonial kind. Her hair was up in a clean braid rather than the loose fall she'd had in his court. She was standing very straight. She was not looking at him. His brain did a specific kind of lurch, the kind that happens when a thing you thought was filed and finished suddenly becomes present and breathing in front of you. Naira. He had not thought she would be dead. He wasn't a man who killed people for politics when banishment would do, and he'd made sure the escort had taken her far enough north to reach the edge settlements before turning back. But he had thought, he realized now, in the space of a single second, that he had thought she would be lesser. Somewhere in the part of his mind he'd kept the door shut on. He'd thought she'd be surviving, subsisting, diminished. He'd thought that the evidence of his decision would be legible in her, the way the aftermath of hard choices often was. She wasn't diminished. She was standing next to the most dangerous Alpha in the Northern Territories, and she was holding herself like she'd been standing there for years. Riker Draven surveyed the room with the unhurried attention of someone who already knew where everything dangerous was and had made his calculations. Then his hand came to the small of Naira's back. Easy, proprietary, the gesture of a man who was not announcing something but simply doing it because it was true. And he leaned down and said something to her in a low voice. Naira nodded, and something at the corner of her mouth moved. Not a smile exactly, something more private than that. Kale became aware, in a crawling and uncomfortable way, that his hands had closed into fists at his sides. He opened them. Lord Castor, standing 2 feet to his right, had gone very still. Riker Draven brought Naira to the center of the hall and introduced her to the Coldwater Confederation's head delegate first. Kyle could see it happening from across the room, watched the Coldwater man's expression move from polite reception to genuine interest in the span of about 30 seconds. Then the Greywood Alliance representative. Then 2 more. And then Riker turned, and his eyes found Kyle's across the width of the hall with the directness of a man who had known exactly where Kyle was standing from the moment he walked in. He started toward him. Naira walked with him. Kyle had about 8 seconds to decide what his face was doing. He went with controlled neutral. It was the face he put on for negotiations where the other side had advantages he needed to not acknowledge. He had never needed it quite this specifically before. Riker stopped about 4 feet away, and the corner of his mouth pulled back in something that was technically a smile. "King Alpha Thornheart," he said. His voice was low, and it carried without effort the way trained voices did. "Riker Draven, Black Wolf territory." "I know who you are," Kale said. "Good." Riker's eyes held something in them. Assessment. And beneath the assessment, something that looked like deliberate patience. The kind that came from knowing you were going to win a conversation and not being in any particular hurry about it. Then we can skip the geography. He angled his shoulders slightly, the gesture of a man presenting something he was proud of without being obvious about the pride. "My queen, Naira." The 2 words landed in Kyle's chest like stones dropped into still water. Naira looked at him. Her expression was not cold. It was not angry. It was not anything he had a ready name for. It was simply present and composed and entirely without the need for him to feel any particular way about her presence. It was the face of someone who had moved past a thing completely. Not forgiven it, not erased it, simply moved past it in the way that a river moves past a stone it used to run up against, by finding a new course and not particularly remembering the stone. "King Alpha," she said. Her voice was even, clear. The accent was the same. Everything else was different. Kael looked at her. He said, because the silence was becoming architectural. "Naira." Her chin dipped. A fraction. That was all. Riker's hand had not left the small of her back, and he was watching Kael with the unhurried attention of someone who had heard a story and was now cross-referencing it against the original source material. "I've been wanting to meet you," Riker said. "Is that so?" "Naira's told me things about Silver Fang Kingdom. Very useful things." The way he said it was conversational, the way a man described finding a good map. "She has a particular eye for detail. Noticed things in her time here I imagine most people missed." He paused, the length of a breath. "Her loss has been my gain." Kael held his gaze for a long beat and then said, "What kind of things?" Riker smiled, full this time, and it didn't reach his eyes, which stayed measuring and calm. "Oh, the kind that changed the shape of a situation. We can discuss it at the table if you like." He looked down at Naira briefly. "We should find our seats." Naira moved with him without looking back at Kael. He stood there and watched them cross the room, and a senior advisor materialized at his elbow, said something about the seating arrangement, and Kael said, "Give me a moment," in a voice that meant, "Do not speak to me right now," and the advisor evaporated. He stood there for what was probably 15 seconds, but felt longer, watching Riker Draven settle into a seat at the main table, and watching Naira take the chair to his right, watching the Coldwater delegate immediately lean over to resume a conversation with her, watching her respond with the focused attention of someone who was not thinking about the man standing across the room at all. "My queen." He walked to his own seat. The summit lasted 2 days. Kael had sat through hundreds of meetings, negotiations, summits, assemblies. He was good in rooms. He read people well, controlled his tells, found pressure points, and leveraged them with precision. He could be patient, or he could be fast, depending on which the situation called for. And he almost always read which it was correctly. These 2 days were different, because across the table and 2 seats down, Naira Vale was doing something he had watched her do in his own court, in his own councils, for 2 years, and he was seeing it now for the first time. Not the performance of it, not the surface of it, but the actual mechanism. She listened. That was the fundamental thing. She listened in a way that most people in rooms like this didn't, which was to say she listened without planning what she was going to say next, without filing information into categories of useful and not useful, without the subtle performance of listening that most political animals had learned. She just actually heard what was being said. And then she spoke, occasionally, with the specific economy of someone who understood that the value of words was in their precision rather than their volume. On the first afternoon, she said 4 sentences that completely reframed a deadlocked discussion about eastern border trade routes between the Iron Seat Pact and the Greywood Alliance. And both parties came away thinking they'd arrived at the solution themselves, which was the mark of someone who was very, very good at what they were doing. On the second morning, she put a question to the Coldwater head delegate that made him go quiet for a full 10 seconds before answering, and the answer he gave opened up an avenue of negotiation that Riker Draven proceeded to walk straight through with the calm certainty of a man who had known the door would be there. Kael watched this. He watched Riker watch Naira. The way the Black Wolf Alpha listened to her in private moments between sessions, the slight tilt of his head that meant he was actually processing what she said rather than waiting for her to finish. The way Riker's guards treated her, not with the watchful containment they showed toward a ward or a political acquisition, but with the easy deference you showed someone whose judgment you'd learned to trust. He watched Naira move through this space, the way she never sought the center of attention and therefore was always subtly at the center of attention. The way she ate her food like someone who had gone hungry and learned to be present in the act of eating. The way she carried a slight tension in her left shoulder. An old tension, he remembered, something she'd always had. And the way Riker had once, without fanfare or apparent consciousness, rested his hand on that shoulder briefly while she was focused on a document, and how the tension had eased. By the end of the first day, Kyle was certain of one thing. Riker Draven was not keeping Naira as a prize or a symbol. He was keeping her because she was essential to what he was building and because he understood that. By the end of the second day, Kyle was certain of something else, something colder and harder and less comfortable. The woman across that table was not the woman he'd banished, not because she'd been fundamentally altered, but because she'd been the whole time and he'd never seen it. She has a particular eye for detail. Noticed things in her time here I imagine most people missed. What had she noticed? What had she said to him 4 months ago, in those early morning sessions when she'd come to his study with something on her face that he'd read as worry and half listened to? What had she told him about the Eastern ledgers? He went back to his rooms on the first night, and he sat in front of the fire and he thought about it, actually thought about it without the door closed. And what came back to him was fragmentary and incomplete and made him feel sick in a way that had nothing to do with illness. She had come to him in the morning. He remembered the light, thin autumn light through the eastern windows. She'd said something about discrepancies, about figures that didn't match between the official trade ledgers and the actual pack territory reports, about Castor Aldrovani's name appearing in contexts that didn't make sense given his stated interests. He'd said, "Naira, I need to focus," or something close to that. She'd said, "This is important, Kyle." He'd said he would look at it later. He had not looked at it later. He had not thought about it again until now, sitting in a room in a neutral city watching firelight move across stone, with the sound of the northern wind outside and a specific cold clarity moving through him like water through a crack. She had been warning him. She had come to him, his mate, the woman he'd trusted with his inner counsels, and she had been warning him about Castor Aldrovane and the Eastern Territories. And 3 months later, Senna Aldrovane, Castor's niece, had stood in front of his court and accused Naira of exactly the kind of conspiracy Naira had been warning him about. He stood up abruptly and went to the window. It was not evidence. He told himself that. It was not proof of anything, just a pattern of circumstance, the kind of thing you could construct around any sequence of events if you were motivated to do so. He had no way of knowing, from here, without investigation, whether what he was thinking was true. But he knew something else. He knew that he had believed Senna without hesitation and had asked Naira to prove her innocence, rather than treating her as someone whose word had weight. He knew that he had searched his mate's quarters and found a single piece of physical evidence and called it sufficient. He knew that when Naira had looked at him in that hall and said someone put that there, he had refused to consider it because considering it meant admitting that his judgment might be wrong, and being wrong in front of his court meant being weak, and being weak meant everything he'd built his life around needed to be re-examined. He stood at the window and breathed the cold air coming through the gap at the frame, and he was very, very still. When he came down to breakfast on the second morning, he looked at Castor Aldrovane across the room, and Castor looked back at him with the open, practiced warmth of a man who had done nothing wrong, and Kyle smiled back at him with the open, practiced warmth of a king who agreed. And behind that warmth, something had changed that Castor could not see yet. On the final evening of the summit, after the formal proceedings had ended and the delegations were in various states of informal gathering, Kyle was standing near one of the large fireplaces with a cup he wasn't drinking from when Naira passed within 2 feet of him on her way to a side table where maps had been laid out. She didn't stop. She didn't look at him. But she also didn't redirect to avoid him, which meant she'd decided something. Decided that he wasn't owed the courtesy of being avoided. "Naira," he said. She stopped. She turned. Her face was still that composed, unreadable thing, and she waited. He searched for what he wanted to say and found that nothing he had was adequate. "You look well," he said, which was the kind of sentence you said when you couldn't say what you meant. "I am well," she said. Just that. He looked at her and she looked at him, and the firelight moved between them. "Riker treats you well," he said. Something shifted in her eyes. Something that was not quite a challenge, but was in the same family as one. "Yes," she said. "He listens when I speak." He took that. He stood there, and he took it, and didn't flinch. He started. "Oh, I know what you made," she said, and her voice was very quiet and very precise, the way a blade was precise. "I'm not interested in having the conversation you want to have right now, Kyle. We're in a neutral city, and we're both here professionally, and I have work to get back to. She turned back to the maps. He stood there for a moment longer, looking at her shoulders, at the clean line of the braid down her back, at the specific way she bent over the map with focused attention and complete indifference to whether he was still standing there or not. He wasn't going to get anything from this moment. There was nothing to get. He turned and walked back toward the main table. He had a lot of thinking to do. Farset. The Silver Fang delegation left Greyville at dawn on the third day. Kale rode at the head of the column and watched the road unspool in front of him and said very little for the first 2 hours. Castor Aldrovane rode 3 positions back and spoke occasionally with his secretary and appeared, as always, completely at ease. Kale thought about Naira standing at that map table. He thought about Riker's hand on the small of her back. He thought about the Coldwater delegate leaning in to speak with her, as though her opinion was something to be sought out. He thought about a bronze seal in a cloth wrapping. "My lord," said Davin Marsh, riding up alongside him. "Not now. My lord, there's something you should know about the summit." Kale looked at him. Davin was 28, had been his captain for 3 years, was not a man who raised things unnecessarily. His expression had that specific quality of someone carrying information they weren't sure how to deliver. "What?" Kyle said. "The Coldwater head delegate," Davin said carefully. "I spoke with one of his junior men last night. He mentioned, in passing, I think he thought I already knew, that they had received a letter 8 months ago, a warning about certain Eastern trade arrangements. The letter was unsigned, but described the Blackthorn Compact's involvement with the border skirmishes in enough detail that the Coldwater people took it seriously." He paused. The junior man described the handwriting and the particular phrasing. He'd seen it compared against other documents. Kale waited. Davin looked straight ahead at the road. He said the handwriting matched letters the Coldwater Archive had received previously from Silver Fang Keep, correspondence from that period. "From who at Silver Fang Keep?" Kyle said. His voice was very level. Davin was quiet for a moment. "From Lady Naira, my lord." The column kept moving. Horses' hooves on packed dirt, the creak of saddle leather, the cold morning air. Kyle rode through all of it with his spine straight and his face controlled and his hands easy on the reins, and inside him something was happening that would have no clean resolution for a very long time. She had known. She had warned him, and when he hadn't listened, she had written letters to neighboring packs, to anyone who might act on the information, trying to protect the kingdom from what was coming, and then she'd been accused of betrayal by the very people she'd been warning him about, and he had believed the accusation without asking a single real question. He rode on. Castor Aldrovane, 3 positions back, was describing something about Greyville's market prices to his secretary, and his voice carried up the column with the easy cadence of a man who believed he had survived a thing intact. He had no way of knowing that the man at the head of the column had just figured out the shape of what he'd done. And 2 days' ride to the north, in Riker Draven's Black Wolf Fortress, Naira was at a table with maps spread out before her, and the Black Wolf Alpha beside her, and she was pointing to something on the eastern border that needed watching, and Riker was listening, actually listening, with the focused attention of a man who had learned early that the most dangerous thing you could do was fail to hear a warning. Outside the fortress window, a rider was being prepared to leave for the Eastern Territories. The letter in his saddlebag had been written in Nira's hand, and in the fortress's lower hall, a man who had ridden hard from Silver Fang territory arrived at the gate and gave the guard a single name, requesting an immediate audience. He said he had information about Lord Castor Aldrovane that the Black Wolf Alpha needed to hear. He said he had proof. The man's name was Corin Hale, and he had ridden 4 days without stopping for anything longer than water and a change of horse. He was 38 years old and had served the Silver Fang Keep's Eastern Trade Office for 11 years, most of that time as senior ledger keeper, a position that required precise literacy, a tolerance for tedium, and the specific kind of invisibility that came from being permanently associated with numbers rather than names. Men like Corin Hale were the architecture of a kingdom, load-bearing and unnoticed, which meant they saw things. Riker received him in the main working room of the fortress, not the formal hall. That was a choice. The formal hall was for displays. This room, long table, maps, the practical debris of administration spread across every surface, was where actual things got decided. and receiving a stranger here said, "I'm taking you seriously enough to let you see how I work." Naira was already in the room when the guards brought Corin in. She was standing at the far end of the table, and when the door opened, she looked up and went very still for a moment, and then something in her face settled into a careful neutrality. She knew him. Corin Hale saw her and stopped moving. The guard behind him nearly walked into his back. "My lady," he said. The title came out of him before he could stop it, the old reflex. Naira said nothing for a moment. Then, "Corin." Riker watched this exchange with the unhurried attention he gave everything, his weight easy on the back legs of his chair, hands flat on the table in front of him. He let the silence breathe. "You know each other," he said. "Not a question." "He worked the Eastern trade ledgers," Naira said. Her voice was controlled. "I spoke with him several times when I was compiling the discrepancy reports." A beat. "The ones I brought to King Alpha Thornheart's attention. The ones Kyle hadn't listened to." The sentence completed itself in the room without anyone saying it. Riker looked at Corin. "Sit down," he said. "Start from where it began." Corin sat. He was still breathing hard from the ride, still carrying road dust in the lines of his face, and he had the particular look of a man who has been holding something for a long time and is now in the specific exhaustion of being close to putting it down. "Lord Castor Aldravane has been running a secondary ledger system for 6 years," he said. "Not just skimming, restructuring entire trade route agreements through Blackthorn Compact intermediaries and pocketing the difference at the Pact territory level before it ever reached the Crown's count. The eastern border skirmishes over the past 8 months weren't territorial disputes. They were clearance operations, moving packs that sat on routes Castor needed uncontested." The room was quiet except for the fire. "Lady Naira found the first thread of it," Corin continued. He didn't look at her when he said it, looked at the table instead, which was either respect or guilt. "She came to me directly, asked me to cross-reference 3 sets of supply figures. I confirmed what she suspected. She told me she was going to bring it to the king." He paused. "That was 4 months ago." "And then she was banished," Riker said. "Yes, my lord." "And you stayed quiet." The silence that followed was not comfortable, and Corin Hale did not try to make it comfortable. "I have a family," he said. "Lord Castor has a long reach in the Eastern Territories. I waited to see if someone else would—" He stopped, tried again. "I was afraid." Riker held him with his gaze for a moment, not punishing him with it, just making the thing true by acknowledging it. Then he looked at Naira. She was looking at Corin, and her expression had the specific quality of a woman deciding whether to spend anger she'd been carrying for a long time. The deciding took a few seconds. Then she exhaled through her nose, very quietly, and let it go. "What changed?" she asked Corin. "Why now?" "Because last week Castor's men came to my office," Corin said, "and they told me I was being reassigned to a northern outpost. A listening post, they called it. It's a storage building a day's ride from the border. Nobody goes there." He met her eyes for the first time. I understood what kind of reassignment it was. Naira looked at him for a moment longer. Then she looked at Riker. Something passed between them. Not words, not gestures, just the specific frequency of 2 people who had spent enough time working together to have a shorthand that didn't require language. Riker's chin moved, almost imperceptibly. Naira turned back to the maps. "Show me exactly where the clearance operations happened," she said to Corin, "and then we're going to figure out what Castor's next move is." Corin leaned forward and put his finger on the map. That night, Riker stood at the window of the upper corridor outside the working room and listened to the wind off the northern range and thought about kings. He had known 3 kings in his life with any intimacy. His father, who had been a good man and a bad ruler, too inclined toward mercy in situations that needed precision. A territorial sovereign in the eastern mountains who had treated his pack like a personal resource and died when they got tired of it. And now Kyle Thornheart, whom he'd never met before Greyveal and had formed a complete picture of from a single summit and a few months of strategic observation. The picture was specific, a man who was genuinely formidable in the areas he'd trained himself in, and genuinely blind in the areas he hadn't, who confused certainty with competence, who had mistaken Naira's patience for passivity and her intelligence for loyalty that didn't need to be earned, who had, in one catastrophic session of wounded pride, thrown away the most useful mind in his inner circle, and handed her, along with everything she knew, to an opponent. Riker had not set out to collect Naira. That wasn't how it had happened. She'd arrived at the northern settlement he used as an eastern waypoint in the middle of a rainstorm, cold through, with 2 days of walking on her boots, and the specific expression of a woman who had made a decision and was not revisiting it. His border captain had sent word. Woman at the gate says she has information about Silver Fang's eastern trade routes, won't say more. Riker had received her because information about Silver Fang's eastern routes was useful, and because he was curious what kind of person walked to the Black Wolf territory in the rain rather than finding shelter and reconsidering. She'd sat across from him in that waypoint building, soaked, with road dirt under her nails and a calm in her eyes that had nothing soft in it, and she'd told him what she knew. She hadn't performed the telling, she hadn't asked for anything in the transaction. She'd laid the information out with the precision of someone who understood its value without needing to oversell it, and when she finished, she'd looked at him and said, "I don't expect protection in exchange for that. I'm giving it to you because it's the right thing to do with information that could stop people from getting killed in border clearance operations they don't understand." He'd looked at her for a long moment. Then he'd asked her if she was hungry. She'd said yes. He'd had food brought and they'd talked for 3 hours. And by the end of it, he'd understood that he was sitting across from someone who thought in systems rather than incidents, who read people the way a tracker read ground, not for what they said, but for what their patterns implied, and who had been treated as a support structure rather than a foundation by the man who'd had her first. He'd offered her a position in his inner circle. She'd asked him what it would require. He told her honestly that he didn't know yet, that he was building something and the shape of it was still emerging, and he needed people around him who could see the shape clearly while it was being made. She'd said, "I'll try it for 3 months." That had been 5 months ago. Now Riker stood at the window and thought about Kael's face in gray vial. The specific quality of the man's stillness when he'd seen Naira across the hall. The way his hands had closed and then opened. The way he'd said her name later, by the fire, with something in his voice that he'd been trying to cover and not quite succeeding. A man who still wanted what he'd thrown away. That was a specific kind of dangerous, not because he was strong and Kael Thornhart was strong, Riker had no illusions about that, but because wanting something back and being wrong about what you were owed were the same thing inside certain men. They became indistinguishable. And indistinguishable things had a way of leading to actions that were difficult to take back. He heard footsteps on the corridor stone and didn't turn around. "You should sleep," Naira said. She stopped beside him at the window. "I was thinking." "I know. You breathe differently when you're thinking about threats." He looked at her sideways. There was something he valued about the way she said things like that. Direct, without cushioning, without the social performance of softening a point that didn't need softening. "Kael Thornhart is going to do something," he said. She was quiet for a moment. The wind moved across the window glass. "Yes," she said. "He figured something out in Grayville. I could see it." "What did you see?" She considered it. He looked at Castor differently on the second day than the first. Something between the evening and the morning shifted his thinking. She paused. "He's going to go after Castor." "And then?" She didn't answer immediately, and the not answering was itself an answer. "He's going to come here," Riker said. "Maybe." "Naira." She looked at him, and he looked back at her with the particular directness he used for things that mattered, the same level gaze he turned on threats and decisions and the rare people he trusted completely. "Whatever he does," Riker said, "whatever he comes here to say, that's your call to make, not mine. But I need to know where your head is before it happens, not after." She held his gaze. The wind came through the gap at the window frame and moved a loose strand of hair across her face, and she didn't touch it. "My head is here," she said, "doing the work we're doing, building the alliance, making sure what happened to those packs on the eastern border doesn't happen again." A beat. "That's where my head is." "That's not quite what I asked." The corner of her mouth moved. "No," she agreed. "It's not." She turned and walked back down the corridor, her footsteps even on the stone, and Riker watched her go and understood that she had answered him anyway, in the way she answered most things, not with the words being asked for, but with the ones that were true. Kael moved fast when he moved. Within a week of returning from Grayville, He had put 3 of his most trusted investigators onto Castor Aldrovani's financial records, given them authority to access archives that were technically restricted, and told them to bring him everything that touched the Eastern trade routes in the past 6 years. He had said nothing to Castor. He had sat across from the man in 2 meetings during that week and been completely normal, attentive, collegial, giving no sign that anything had shifted. This was not difficult for him. He had been managing his face in rooms full of enemies since he was 16, and it was a skill so deeply ingrained it no longer felt like effort. It felt like breathing. Selena Aldrovani was another matter. She came to him on the 5th day with a proposed amendment to a Northern Trade Agreement, the kind of routine administrative matter she brought to him 3 or 4 times a month. She was dressed well, as always. She smiled at him across the desk, warm and precise, and laid out her amendment, and he listened with the appropriate attention and asked the appropriate questions. His investigators had found the first layer of Castor's secondary ledger system the previous afternoon. The framework of what Naira had warned him about 4 months ago was starting to come clear, and with it came a specific chill that had nothing to do with the room temperature. He looked at Selena across his desk. She had sat in this room and told him her story with perfect construction. The reluctant witness, the painful obligation, the performance of a woman choosing kingdom over comfort. He had listened. He had believed. And then he had stood in his great hall and watched the woman he'd taken for granted for 2 years go to her knees and beg him, and he had called it justice. "My lord?" Sena's voice was even. She'd noticed something in his face. "The amendment looks fine," he said. "I'll have it processed." She held his gaze for a fraction of a second longer than was necessary, and then she said, "Thank you," and stood, and the slight tension in her exit said she hadn't entirely decided whether something was wrong or not. He watched the door close behind her and thought, soon. On the 10th day, his lead investigator came to him with a sealed document folder and a face that had the flat effect of a man who had found something he wished he hadn't. Kyle read the contents of the folder in his study, alone, with the fire going and the door locked. It took him an hour. Not because the documents were complex, they were, but he read quickly, but because he kept stopping and staring at the fire and waiting for the sick rolling thing in his chest to settle before he continued. It didn't settle. He kept reading anyway. The secondary ledger system was real, had been running for 6 years. Funds diverted, packed territories destabilized deliberately to facilitate route control, the Blackthorn Compact acting as intermediary and taking a percentage that would have bought a small kingdom. The eastern border skirmishes, 4 of them in the past 8 months, each one traced back to pressure applied through Castor Aldrovani's network, each one in territories that sat on routes the Compact needed. And Naira had found the first thread of it 4 months ago and brought it to him, and he had told her to come back later. He closed the folder. He sat for a long time. The fire burned down and he didn't put more wood on it, and the room got cold and he sat in the cold and breathed. The thing that was happening inside him was not guilt exactly. Guilt was too simple a word for it. It was the structural collapse of a narrative he'd been living in, the one where he was a king who made hard decisions based on evidence and reason, who was severe but fair, who had done a painful thing because it was necessary. That story was not true. It had never been true. He had done what prideful men did when their certainty was threatened. He'd crushed the thing that threatened it, rather than examine his own judgment. And Naira had walked out of his keep, and instead of diminishing, had become exactly what she had always been, just somewhere else, in service to someone else, helping someone else's kingdom. He got up and put wood on the fire. Then he sat back down and began planning how to destroy Castor Aldrovani's network completely, and what came after. The confrontation happened 11 days later, and Kyle ran it the way he ran everything he was certain about. Fast, hard, no room for negotiation. Castor was in the council chamber with 4 of his senior allies when the king's guard sealed the room. 3 of the 4 allies immediately made the calculation that a sealed room with Cale Thornhart in it was a different situation than they'd agreed to be part of that morning, and their faces showed it. Castor showed nothing. He was good. Cale gave him that. "My lord," Castor said, as though this were a meeting that had simply started earlier than expected. "Is there something urgent?" "Sit down," Kyle said. "I am sitting." "Then stop looking like you're about to stand up." Castor looked at him with the measured calm of a man who was doing arithmetic behind his eyes. His hands were flat on the table. "You've been in my records," he said. 11 years' worth, Kyle said. "The clean ones and the ones you thought were clean." "I don't know what you think you've found." "Stop." The word landed very flat. "I know everything. I know the compact's involvement. I know the border clearance operations. I know about Corin Hale, and I know what you plan to do with him before he reached someone who would listen." He paused. "I know what you had your niece do 4 months ago." Something moved through Castor's face. Very quick, very controlled. Selena acted independently. Castor. Just the name. The way a man said a word when he was done with the shape of the conversation and wanted to get to what was underneath. "You had a man in my keep accuse my maid of the exact crime she had warned me your family was committing. And I believed it, because I was too proud to consider that someone I trusted had played me." His voice hadn't risen. It was still very level and very cold, the voice he used when he was absolutely certain and had nothing left to perform. "That's the part I haven't decided how to handle yet. What I've decided is what happens to you." Castor looked at him for a long moment, and then, with the specific precision of a man who had run out of moves and knew it, he said, "What do you want?" "Everything. Full accounting, every name, every route, every pack lord you've compromised." Kyle looked at him across the table. "And Selena?" Castor's jaw tightened. She stood in my great hall and destroyed an innocent woman in front of 1,000 witnesses," Kyle said. "And the woman she destroyed is currently building a territorial alliance with Riker Draven that will rewrite the map of the North. So yes, Selena." The silence in the room had a specific quality to it. The 4 allied pack lords were not breathing loudly enough to be noticed, which meant they were being very careful. Castor looked at the table. Then he looked up. "You'll have it," he said. "I know I will," Kyle said. He stood. "Get your affairs in order. You have until morning." He walked out of the council chamber and the guards sealed it behind him, and he stood in the corridor for a moment and breathed through his nose and looked at the stone floor, and the cold clarity he'd been running on for 11 days did not become warmth. He hadn't expected it to. He walked back toward his study and thought about what he would have to do next. Because dismantling Castor's network was the obligation. It was the debt owed to the border packs, to the kingdom, to the basic function of justice. That part was straightforward, even if it was hard. What came after was not straightforward. He had a letter to write. He had been thinking about it for 11 days, and he did not know how to write it, which was a new experience. He was not a man who had difficulty finding words. He had built his kingship on the ability to say precise things in situations that didn't invite precision. He sat down at his desk and pulled a blank sheet toward him and looked at it. The woman he owed this letter to was, as of 3 weeks ago, standing beside the most dangerous alpha in the Northern Territories and being introduced to foreign delegations as his queen. She had looked at Kyle across the summit hall with the composure of someone who had filed him correctly under a past category and was not interested in reopening the file. She had stopped walking when he called her name and then told him, quietly and without cruelty, that she was not interested in the conversation he wanted to have. He picked up the quill. He set it down. He looked at the fire. The thing he had not let himself think directly, not once in the past 11 days, because thinking it directly made it impossible to function, was this. He had not lost a useful ally, or a capable mate, or a political asset. He had lost the specific person who had known him, his blind spots, his postures, the exact sound of his certainty when it was real and when it was performance, and had chosen to stay anyway. Had tried, even at the end, to protect something he'd already decided wasn't worth protecting. That wasn't a ledger entry. That wasn't a resource. He knew what that was. He'd just been too busy being a king to understand it while it was in front of him. He picked up the quill again. He wrote, "Naira." And then he stopped. Because somewhere between the name and the next word, a rider was crossing the outer gate of Silver Fang Keep at speed, and Davin Marsh was already moving toward the king's study, and the message the rider carried had not come from a neutral source. It had come from Riker Draven's fortress, and it said that a rebellion had moved in the Northern Territories 3 days ago. Not a border skirmish, not a pressure operation, but a full assault on the Black Wolf Alpha's eastern holdings, coordinated across 6-pack territories simultaneously. the kind of operation that had been planned for months and was moving too fast for a single response to meet it cleanly. Kyle read the message, and his hand went very still on the desk. At the bottom, in handwriting he would have recognized anywhere, was a single line that had not been included in the official message text. It was not signed. It didn't need to be. The Blackthorn Compact funded the rebellion. Castor gave them the roots. Whatever you're doing, do it now. There are pack families on those roads. He was already standing when Davin came through the door. Get my captains, Kyle said. My lord, all of them. Right now. He folded the message and put it inside his coat, against his chest, the instinct of a man keeping something close without examining why. We ride north at dawn. Davin's expression had the look of a man computing the political implications of that sentence and deciding not to say any of them out loud. To Black Wolf territory. To Black Wolf territory, Kale confirmed. He walked to the window and looked out at the night, and his jaw was set and his eyes were the specific gray of a sky that has made its decision. He thought about Nira's handwriting on that message. He thought about a woman who had tried to protect his kingdom before being thrown out of it, who was now, without hesitation, warning him to protect someone else's. He thought about what she was doing right now, 4 days' ride north, while a rebellion moved through the territories she'd spent 5 months helping build. He thought about what it meant that the thought of her standing in the path of that was the thing that had made him stand up faster than the politics, faster than the strategy, faster than the calculation of what it cost a Silver Fang king to ride his army into Black Wolf lands uninvited. He didn't let himself think it all the way through. There were things a man couldn't afford to see clearly while he still had work to do. He had learned that, at least. He would see them clearly later, if there was a later. Outside the window, Silver Fang Keep began to move. Silver Fang rode north in the dark. Kyle had not slept. He'd spent the hours before dawn in the war room with his captains, pulling maps apart and putting them back together, working the logistics of moving 400 mounted soldiers into Black Wolf territory without it reading as an invasion. The distinction mattered. Arriving with an army at Riker Draven's border uninvited was the kind of thing that started wars even when both sides had the same enemy, and Kyle had enough wars already without manufacturing one out of poor timing. He sent a rider ahead with 2 hours lead carrying a message in his own hand. Silver Fang rides to support Black Wolf territory against the Blackthorn Compact offensive. No political conditions, no territorial claims. We arrive as allies or we turn back at the border. Your call. He didn't know if Riker would believe it. He wasn't sure he would have believed it, in Riker's position. A king who had wronged a woman showing up with an army the moment that woman's adopted territory was under threat had a very particular smell to it, the smell of a man trying to buy something back with someone else's crisis. He rode anyway. The terrain north of Silver Fang's border was difficult in the specific way of land that had never been organized for anyone's convenience. Rocky flats giving way to forested ridges, the roads narrowing to single-track paths between old-growth trees that blocked the stars. His column moved in near silence, the kind of disciplined quiet that 400 soldiers trained together eventually achieved without being told. Horses' hooves muffled on soft ground, the creak of armor kept to a minimum. Davin Marsh rode at his left shoulder and said nothing, which was one of Davin's most useful qualities. Kale rode and thought and kept his face forward. The message from Nira had not left his chest. He was aware of it against his ribs, with the particular awareness of something that had no tactical relevance and kept demanding attention anyway. The handwriting, the single line appended without signature. There are pack families on those roads. Not, help us. Not, I need you. Just the fact of people in danger and the expectation that the fact would be sufficient, as though she still knew, despite everything, what would move him, as though she'd written it in the certainty that he was still the man who could be moved by that. He didn't examine whether that said something about her trust or just about her tactical efficiency. He filed it and kept writing. The border captain who met them at the Black Wolf territorial line was a woman named Sora, mid-30s, leather armor worn correctly, a scar across her left hand that had healed into a ridge of white tissue. She looked at Kyle's column with the flat assessment of someone calculating threat and resource simultaneously and not pretending she wasn't. Lord Alpha Draven got your message, she said. And? He said to bring you to the Eastern Holding. She paused a beat. He said if you came with less than 300, you were performing, and if you came with more than 500, you were invading. 400, Kyle said. Then you're serious. She turned her horse. Keep your column tight. The roads are being watched. He followed her and didn't ask by whom. The Eastern Holding was not a fortress in the Silver Fang sense, not the ancient stone permanence of a keep that had been built to last centuries. It was a working installation, expanded pragmatically over years, built for function rather than statement. Walls that were solid without being decorative, towers positioned for line of sight rather than impression. Everything about it said, this is a place where people work, and if you come here to fight, they will be very efficient about ending it. Riker met Kyle in the outer courtyard without ceremony. The two men stood in the gray pre-dawn light and looked at each other, and there was a moment, 3, 4 seconds, where the whole thing balanced on a very fine edge. Two Alpha Kings, both with armies at their backs, meeting in one's territory at the other's request, with a dead conspiracy between them and a woman whose name neither of them said. Riker spoke first. You burned Castor. Completely, Kyle said. Everything you need to connect his network to the compact offensive is in a sealed document with my investigator. I'll get it to you within the day. Riker's eyes stayed on him, measuring, the same measuring look he'd had in Graviel, the look of a man who did not take things at face value and was not apologetic about that. Why? He said. Kale held his gaze. Because he ran a 6-year conspiracy out of my court, and I didn't see it. Because he destroyed an innocent person to protect it. Because those are my failures and they're being paid for by pack families on roads in your territory. He paused. And because I owe a debt I can't actually repay, but this is the closest thing to a down payment I have. The courtyard was quiet. Somewhere in the distance there was the sound of horses being moved, soldiers repositioning. Riker looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, She's on the Eastern Road, coordinating evacuation of the Harrow settlements before the compact forces reach the valley crossing. Kale took the sentence. Alone? With 20 of my people. A pause. She insisted. Of course she did, Kale said. And something in his voice on those 4 words was not controlled in the way the rest of him was controlled, and Riker heard it, and neither of them commented on it. Your cavalry, Riker said, can move faster than anything I have positioned currently. The valley crossing is 2 hours east if you push. Then we're done talking, Kyle said. Riker looked at him one more moment. Then he stepped aside. Don't get her killed, he said. Very flat, very clear. The sentence of a man who knew exactly what he was saying and who he was saying it to. Kyle was already moving. 2 hours east was accurate if the roads were clean, and the roads were not clean. The Blackthorn Compact's offensive was not a single force. It was distributed, intentionally designed to be too spread to meet at a single point, fast-moving columns of contract fighters who had been paid to hit and disperse rather than hold ground. 3 of those columns had reached the valley approaches ahead of what anyone had projected, which meant either the intelligence on their movement speed was wrong, or someone had been feeding them better information than the Black Wolf network knew about. Kyle found this out from a wounded rider he nearly ran over on the Eastern Road, a young Black Wolf soldier with an arrow through his left shoulder who was still moving on instinct, horse barely at a walk. Davin pulled him up and got the information in 30 seconds, and then looked at Kyle. She's at the Harrow Valley crossing, the rider managed. Compact column hit the northern approach an hour ago. She was still moving people through when I left. Kale looked at Davin. Davin looked at Kale. How many in the compact column? Kale said to the rider. 60, maybe 70, moving fast. Against Naira's 20. Kale didn't finish the calculation. He kicked his horse to a gallop, and the column surged behind him, and the road became a blur of dark trees and cold air, and the specific narrowing of thought that happened when he was moving towards something that needed to end a particular way. He had ridden into worse odds than this. He had ridden into situations that by any rational accounting should have ended badly, and hadn't because he was fast, and because he was brutal when brutal was required, and because he had never in 15 years of fighting allowed himself the luxury of imagining the outcome before he'd created it. But 15 years of fighting had also taught him something he hadn't known at 16. The outcome you were trying to create mattered to how you fought. A man fighting for territory fought differently than a man fighting for something that couldn't be replaced. The second kind was more dangerous. He had always been the first kind. He was not the first kind right now, and he knew it, and he rode harder. The Harrow Valley Crossing was a wide stone bridge over a river that ran fast with snowmelt, flanked on both sides by a settlement of maybe 200 people, families mostly, the kind of community that had grown up around a crossing point because crossings were useful and useful places attracted lives. The settlement was mid-evacuation when Kyle column arrived, which meant it was chaos organized by someone who knew what they were doing. Carts moving, children carried, the elderly helped by anyone with a free hand, all of it flowing in the same direction away from the northern approach. The compact column was visible from the ridge above the valley. 63 fighters, as it turned out. He had time to count briefly from the high ground, moving in the practice spread formation of people who had done this before. Organized violence, the kind that knew how to work a settlement and was not hesitating. Between the compact column and the evacuation lines, 20 Black Wolf soldiers had formed a defensive screen, thin and holding by will rather than numbers. And at the center of the screen, on foot, was Naira. She was directing traffic. That was the only way to describe it. She was moving between the defensive line and the evacuation flow with the complete focus of someone who had assessed the available time and the available people, and had constructed a system out of both and was now running the system. She had a Black Wolf soldier's sword in her hand, which she was carrying in the specific way of someone who had been taught to use it and was prepared to but would prefer not to. Her braid had come partially loose. There was mud on her boots and what looked like blood on her left sleeve, though it was hard to tell at distance whose blood it was. She had not seen Kyle's column yet. She was looking north, calculating the compact's approach speed against the remaining families still crossing the bridge. Kyle took all of this in during approximately 4 seconds on the ridge. Then he said, "Column left, cavalry forward," and Silver Fang came off the ridge like water off a cliff. The fight was not long. 63 compact fighters who had been expecting 20 Black Wolf soldiers and a settlement in partial evacuation were not prepared for 400 Silver Fang cavalry coming off the high ground at speed. The compact column did what trained contract fighters did when the math stopped working. They broke formation and moved to disperse, which was smart, which was what they were supposed to do, which saved most of their lives. Kale's cavalry swept the approach clean in under 15 minutes. Clean meaning the compact column was routed, 7 fighters down, the rest scattering into the tree lines where they would be somebody else's problem or nobody's, depending on how fast they moved. No Silver Fang casualties. 2 Black Wolf soldiers with injuries that would heal. The settlement evacuation completed across the bridge while the fight was still happening. The last cart moving over the stone as Kyle's rear riders were finishing the sweep of the northern approach. When it was done, Kyle dismounted and handed his reins to Davin and walked toward the bridge. Nira was standing at the near end of it. She had her sword lowered, and she was watching him cross the approach ground toward her, and her expression had the particular quality of someone processing several things at once and not yet having finished. He stopped about 6 feet from her. They looked at each other. Behind him, his soldiers were moving through the efficient aftermath of a short engagement. Around her, the last of the evacuating families were clearing the bridge. The river ran loud beneath the stone. Her left sleeve had blood on it from a cut across her forearm, not deep, but real, and her breathing was still elevated from the adrenaline. She looked. He searched for the word and found it. Present. Completely, entirely present. The way people looked when they had just been very close to something bad, and had come through the other side of it still intact. "You came," she said. "You warned me," he said. She held his gaze. "That's not why I warned you." "I know." Silence. The river. The distant sound of his soldiers and hers establishing a perimeter. "The families," she said, looking past him toward the north. "Are the other approaches clear?" "Riker's repositioning to cover the valley exits. We hold this crossing until he has the northern roads." He paused. "They're safe." She nodded. One single tight movement, and he could see the specific release in her shoulders when she did it, the physical drop of attention she'd been holding for hours. He looked at her arm. "That needs to be cleaned." "I know." "Naira, not here," she said, quietly. Not cold, not angry, just the voice of someone who knew exactly what was coming and was choosing the time and ground for it. "Not right now. There's still work." He looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded, and she turned back toward the settlement, and he turned back toward his captains, and they worked the crossing for another 3 hours side by side, without speaking about anything except the tactical problem in front of them. It was, he thought, both the hardest and the most natural thing he'd done in months. It was late afternoon when the perimeter was established. The compact forces confirmed routed from the valley approaches, and Riker's reinforcements arrived to consolidate the holding. The light had gone golden and flat, the way it did in the north when the sun came in sideways through pine, and the settlement families were starting to return across the bridge to check what they'd left behind. Kale found Naira sitting on a stone wall at the edge of the settlement, her arm wrapped in clean cloth that one of the Black Wolf medics had applied. She was looking at the river. She didn't move when he sat down on the same wall, 6 inches of space between them. "Senna is in custody," he said. "Castor gave everything. The Compact's network in Silver Fang territory is finished." She was quiet for a moment. "Good," she said. And then, "How many pack families were hit on the eastern routes before you moved?" "3 settlements, too bad. One," he stopped. "One that we didn't get to in time." The silence that followed was the specific silence of 2 people sitting with a thing that couldn't be fixed, only acknowledged. "I should have listened to you," he said. He had been trying for 11 days to find a version of these words that was adequate and had not found one, so he said the plain version. 4 months ago. You came to me and you told me what you'd found, and I told you to come back later, and then I believed a lie that destroyed your life. And the people on those roads paid for it. That's..." He stopped. "There's no version of this where I get to feel better about that." She looked at the river. "No," she said. "There isn't." He took that. "I'm not here to ask you for anything," he said. "I want to be clear about that. I came because your message said there were families on the roads, and because Castor's network was my failure and the debt is mine. Not because I thought..." He stopped again. "I'm not here to ask you for anything." She turned her head and looked at him. The late light was coming in from the west, and it caught the planes of her face, and she had the particular expression he remembered from all those morning sessions in his study. The one where she was listening not just to what was being said, but to the architecture of it, the shape of what someone meant versus what they were choosing to say. "You were going to write me a letter," she said. He looked at her. "How did you..." "Because I know how you move," she said very quietly. "You found out the truth, you dealt with Castor, and then you sat in your study and stared at a blank page for a long time. That's exactly what you did. I know because it's what I would have done in your position." A pause. "What were you going to say?" He looked at the river. "I don't know," he said. "I had your name and then nothing." She nodded as though this confirmed something she had already known. And then she said, with the same precision and clarity she brought to everything, "Kyle, I don't hate you. I want you to know that, because I think you're sitting next to me expecting hatred, and what I actually feel is much harder to explain than that." He waited. "What I feel," she said, "is that I'm different now. Not because of what you did to me. The banishment, the accusation, all of that. That was painful, but it didn't break me. What I feel is that I spent 2 years in your court being useful in ways you never fully saw and quiet about things I should have said louder, and that was my failure as much as yours. And now I am somewhere that sees me clearly, doing work that matters, and I am..." She paused, looked for the word. "I am not who I was, and she can't come back, even if I wanted her to." The river ran under them. Somewhere across the water a child was calling for someone, and a voice called back. "I know," he said. "Do you?" He looked at her. And what he said next cost him more than the battle had, more than the 11 days of methodical dismantling of Castor's network, more than any of the controlled hard things he'd spent 15 years perfecting the ability to do. "Yes," he said. "I know. You're not mine anymore. You were never. I never earned that. I just assumed it and then punished you for my own failure, and you survived and built something real without me, and you are entirely right to have done exactly that." He said it all the way through without stopping, because stopping would have meant not finishing. "I know." Neera looked at him for a long time. The setting light was very quiet. "Okay," she said. Not warm, not cold, just real. A rider was crossing the bridge at speed, black wolf colors, heading toward the command position where Riker's captains had set up. Nira watched the rider and her eyes narrowed. "That's Sora," she said, standing. Kale was on his feet in the same moment because he knew that riding speed and he'd been reading it his whole life, and what it said was, "Something has gone wrong." What? Sora had barely stopped her horse before she was off it. She looked at Nira first, then at Kyle, with the flat, urgent face of someone carrying information that had no good delivery. "Lord Alpha Draven sent me," she said. "There's been a development in the northern approach. We intercepted a compact courier 2 hours ago." She held out a sealed document, broken open, to Nira. "The offensive on the valley. It wasn't the main force, it was a draw, designed to pull Black Wolf reinforcements east." Nira took the document and read it. Her face did not change in any dramatic way. It went very still instead, in the way faces did when the mind behind them was moving very fast through the implications of something and hadn't finished. "The fortress," she said. "Yes," Sora said. "Riker is at the fortress." "Yes." Kale looked between them. "How many?" 200, Sora said. "Compact fighters plus—" She stopped, looked at Nira with something in her expression that was not just tactical concern. "Plus what?" Nira said. "Very flat." Sora said a name. It was not the name of a compact commander. It was not the name of a foreign rival. It was the name of someone inside Riker's inner circle. A senior captain, a man who had been with Riker for 4 years, who had sat at the working table and handled maps and eaten at the same long table where Corin Hale had given his testimony. Nira went absolutely still. The thing that moved through her face in the next 3 seconds was not the simple devastation of surprise. It was something older and more structural. The specific collapse that happened when a person understood that the safety they had built, the carefully chosen ground they had moved to after losing everything once, had been undermined from the inside by someone she had chosen to trust. Someone she had read correctly in every external way and missed in the one way that mattered. She had survived being wrong about Kyle. She had survived the banishment, the cold stone, the northern wilderness, the slow building of something new from the raw materials of her own capability. She had done it by choosing better, by looking harder, by trusting her judgment in a new context with a new set of people she had evaluated herself. And her judgment, she was now being told, had been wrong again. Not about Riker, about the man behind him. Kale watched her absorb this, and he did not say anything, because there was nothing to say that wasn't an intrusion into something private and structural that she needed to get through on her own. He knew this the way he knew terrain. Not from theory, but from having mapped a similar place in himself the night he read Castor's ledgers. She breathed through her nose once, deep and controlled. Then she looked at Kyle. He was already looking at her. "How fast can your cavalry move?" she said. Not, "Will you help?" Not, "I need you." Just the tactical question, precise and immediate, the question of a woman who had just had the ground pulled out from under her and had not gone down. He held her eyes. "Faster than anything else on this road." She turned to Sora. "Tell me everything you know about the fortress approach." Sora told her. She listened the way she always listened, all the way through without interruption. And when Sora finished, Nira looked at the document again, and then looked at the road north, and then looked back at Kyle with an expression he had never seen on her face before. It was not the expression of the woman who had knelt on his cold stone floor and begged him to believe her. It was not the expression of the composed queen he had watched across the summit table in Greyvile. It was something newer and harder and entirely her own. The face of a woman who had been broken once, had built herself back from the pieces, and was now standing in the second worst moment of her life, and discovering that she was still standing. "There's a man in that fortress right now," she said, "who trusted the wrong person and doesn't know it yet." Her voice was very quiet and very controlled. "That is not going to happen to him." Kyle looked at her, and in that look, in the space of that specific moment, Nira's eyes on his, the river behind them, the north road ahead, the last light going out of the sky. He understood with a completeness he had not had before what he had thrown away. And he understood that understanding it changed nothing about who she was now. And he understood that knowing both of those things simultaneously and choosing to act anyway without any promise of return was the only thing left that was worth doing. "Mount up," he said to Davin, without looking away from her. The column began to move, and somewhere in Riker Draven's fortress, a traitor who had planned everything correctly was about to discover that he had not planned for this. The North Road at night was not a road anymore. It was a judgment. Kale rode at the front, and the darkness came at him in pieces. Tree line, rock face, the pale cut of the path between, and he processed each piece the way he'd been processing terrain his whole life, automatically, the way breathing was automatic, while the thinking part of him was somewhere else entirely. 400 horses behind him, moving at a pace just below what would exhaust them before arrival. 2 hours, maybe less if the road held. Sora riding parallel with her Black Wolf soldiers folded into the column's flanks. And Naira, 3 positions back, riding like someone who had made a decision and was now simply executing it. No deliberation left in her posture, just forward motion and cold intent. He had watched her mount up without ceremony, without looking at him for confirmation or direction, and something in that had settled a thing in his chest he hadn't known was unsettled. She was not waiting for anyone's permission. She had never been waiting for anyone's permission. That was what he'd missed, for 2 years, standing 3 feet away from it. Davin came up alongside him in the dark. 2 compact outriders on the ridge above us, Davin said quietly. Sora's people have eyes on them. Let them see us, Kael said. Davin looked at him sideways. That pulls the element of, let them see us, Kael said again. If the traitor inside the fortress thinks help is coming from the east, he holds his position. He waits. He doesn't do something irreversible before we arrive. He paused. Riker needs to be alive when we get there. Davin was quiet for a moment. And if the Outriders signal the compact force to hit us on the road? Then we fight on the road, Kael said. But they won't. 200 fighters positioned at a fortress don't abandon a siege to take cavalry in open terrain. The math doesn't work. He felt Davin process this. Run the tactical arithmetic. Arrive at the same conclusion with slightly less certainty than Kael felt, but enough to not argue. That was the particular trust between them. Not blind agreement, but the specific willingness to follow a line of thinking to its end, even when the footing felt uncertain. They rode. The Black Wolf Fortress came into view from the last ridge as a set of lit windows in darkness, which was not a good sign. Lit windows at this hour meant the interior was active in a way that night operations were not supposed to be. The outer wall torches were burning, but the pattern was wrong. Too many on the eastern face, not enough on the northern, which meant the defensive attention was oriented incorrectly for the threat that was supposed to be outside. Kael reined in at the ridge and Naira pulled up beside him without being asked, and looked at the fortress and said, very quietly, "He's already inside the walls. The traitor, or the compact." "The traitor opened a gate," she said. "The compact fighters are inside the outer wall already. That's why the torches are wrong. They're not defending the perimeter, they're managing the interior." She studied the fortress for 3 seconds more. Riker's people are holding the keep itself. The inner doors. They don't know who to trust, so they're trusting no one, which means they're isolated inside their own fortress. She was right. He knew she was right because he'd reached the same conclusion 2 seconds after she said it, which meant she'd gotten there 2 seconds faster, which meant she'd been reading it from the moment the ridge gave them the view. "The eastern postern," she said. "It's a small gate, maintenance access. If the compact fighters are focused on the inner keep doors, the postern won't be a priority. We can get a small force through it and reach Riker from inside while your cavalry holds the outer yard." He looked at her. "You know this fortress." "I've been living here for 5 months." A pause that was not quite dry humor, but was adjacent to it. "I know where every door goes." He held her gaze for 1 second. "Lead us in." She turned her horse without ceremony and moved along the ridge toward the descent path, and Kael followed, and the column behind him adjusted without being told, because soldiers who had been watching their king ride for 2 hours in one direction trusted the change of direction without needing the reason explained. Nira brought them to the eastern postern in 20 minutes of very careful movement through terrain that required silence more than speed, picking through a dry creek bed, then along a stone wall that marked an old field boundary, then through a gap in the outer planting that she navigated from memory in near total darkness, never hesitating, never backtracking. Kael rode directly behind her and watched how she moved through the land she'd learned, and understood in a specific and unglamorous way what 5 months of genuine investment in a place looked like. She had not been a guest here. She had not been kept. She had been a person who had arrived and paid attention and made the place her own understanding by virtue of caring about it, which was the only way any place became truly known. The postern gate was iron-braced wood, 12 feet high, set into the eastern wall between two towers. Naira dismounted 30 yards back and went to it on foot, staying low, Kyle behind her with Davin and 8 selected soldiers. The rest of the column she had positioned in the outer approach with precise instructions. Hold the yard, cut off retreat, do not fire toward the keep without signal. She tested the postern with her hand. It was barred from inside. She didn't pause. She turned and looked at Kyle's column and said to one of his soldiers, a broad man named Wick, who had been with Silver Fang for 12 years, "You're the strongest in this column." Wick looked at her, looked at Kyle. Kyle nodded. Wick unslung the iron ram from his saddle pack. The postern came open on the third hit, and they went through. The interior of the fortress was a specific kind of chaos, not the chaos of a rout, which was loud and directionless, but the chaos of a contained crisis, which was tight and navigated, people moving with purpose through narrow corridors toward positions they understood. Compact fighters in the outer ward, not uniformed but wearing the black armbands that designated paid contract work. Black Wolf soldiers on the upper walkways and behind the inner keep doors, holding without advancing, short on information, long on discipline. The fighting started 30 seconds after Kyle's group came through the postern. 3 compact fighters came around the corner of the inner courtyard wall and had about 2 seconds of genuine surprise before Kyle's people were on them. It was close quarters work, which was the worst kind and the most honest kind. No tactics, no positioning, just the immediate brutal arithmetic of who was faster and harder and less willing to be dead. Kyle took the first man himself. Not from strategy, but because the man came at him and he was in front and stepping aside would have cost a second he didn't have. His sword arm knew the work. His body had been doing this since 16 and it remembered everything, remembered it below the level of thought, which was the only way it was survivable. To let the body run on its training while the mind stayed above the immediate violence and kept reading the larger shape of things. The larger shape of things was, Riker was in the inner keep was holding, and there was a man somewhere in this fortress who had opened a gate and was either already inside with the Black Wolf Alpha or positioned to do something that couldn't be undone. Nira had broken left the moment the fighting started and taken Sora and 4 soldiers with her. Kyle didn't stop her. He didn't even process making the choice not to stop her. She was already gone, moving toward a staircase he hadn't identified yet, and his body was still occupied with the arithmetic of the immediate fight. He came through the inner courtyard with his people in a hard push, taking the compact fighters from the rear, while Black Wolf soldiers above held their attention from the front. And it was ugly, and it was efficient, and it was over in 6 minutes in the way short, brutal things were over. Suddenly, with the specific stillness that fell after the last piece of resistance stopped. He stood in the courtyard with blood on his sword arm and someone else's blood across his left shoulder, and his breathing elevated but controlled, and he looked up at the inner keep door. A face appeared at the upper slit. Black Wolf soldier. Young, scared, resolute. "Silver Fang King Alpha," Kael said, loud and clear. "I have Sora of the Black Wolf Border Command with me. Open the door." A long pause. Then the bolts drew back. Riker was on the second floor of the inner keep in the war room, which was the most defensible interior position in the building, and he was alive, and he was bleeding from a cut along his right forearm that had been roughly wrapped, and he was sitting at the same table where Corin Hale had given his testimony and staring at a man who was standing against the far wall with 3 Black Wolf soldiers' swords at his throat. The man was Brennan Cole, senior captain, 4 years in Riker's service. He was not a large man, medium height, compact, with the forgettable face of someone who had cultivated forgettability deliberately. He was breathing hard and his eyes were moving, still calculating, still running numbers on a situation that had stopped adding up the way he'd planned. Kael took in the room in one sweep, and his eyes went to Riker, who looked at him with the expression of a man who was in pain and extremely angry, and managing both with the controlled precision of a person who had not stopped thinking tactically despite the circumstances. "Thornhart," Riker said. "Draven," Kael said. A beat that under different circumstances might have been almost absurd. Your timing, Riker said, is the second most surprising thing that's happened tonight. What's the first? Riker's eyes went to Brennan. Finding out who opened my eastern gate. Kale looked at Brennan Cole. Brennan looked back at him with the flat assessment of a man making one final calculation before accepting a result. Whatever the calculation was, he arrived at the result without changing his expression. How long? Kyle said. What? Brennan's voice was hoarse. How long have you been running for the compact? Brennan looked at the 3 sword points at his throat and then back at Kyle. 18 months, he said. No theater in it. The voice of a man who had decided that honesty was the only remaining currency he had. Started as information, became more. The rebellion offensive, Kyle said. You designed the timing. I suggested the sequence. The compact designed the offensive. The valley draw, the east pull, all of that was to get Riker isolated. Yes. The room was very quiet. The 3 Black Wolf soldiers held their positions with a stillness that spoke of extreme restraint. These were men who had followed Brennan Cole for 4 years, who had trusted him as their captain, and they were not moving because moving might mean doing something that couldn't be undone, and they were waiting for Riker's word. Riker stood up from the table. He was a large man, and the room was not a large room, and when he stood up, the physics of the space changed. He walked to within 4 feet of Brennan Cole and stood there. And the quality of his stillness was the quality of a very powerful thing that was choosing, deliberately and at cost, not to move. Why? Riker said. Just the word. No inflection. Brennan held his gaze. Because they offered me what you couldn't. What? Landholding, Eastern Territory, my own pack, my own ground. He said it without apology and without performance, with the flat specificity of a man reciting facts he had already made his peace with. I've been a captain my whole life. I wanted to be more. The silence afterward was its own kind of verdict. Riker looked at him for a long moment. His breathing was even. His face had the specific blankness of a man who has moved past the emotion of a thing and arrived at the decision of it. He turned to the Black Wolf soldiers. Take him. Brennan was taken. Kael was at the window when Naira came into the war room. He heard her enter and heard the specific change in the room's quality that her presence produced. Riker turning from the table, some of the held tension in the space releasing, the way 2 people who had built something together in the same room changed the air when they were both present in it. The compact fighters are routing, she said. Your cavalry in the outer yard cut off the retreat. It's over. She was talking to Kael, but looking at Riker, scanning him with the quick focused attention of someone checking for damage. Her eyes found the wrapped arm, and her jaw tightened slightly. Sit down, she said to Riker. I'm fine. You're bleeding through the wrapping. Sit down. Riker sat down. There was something in the ease of the compliance that told a story. Not dominance, not submission, but the specific trust of a man who had learned that certain instructions from certain people were worth following without argument. Nira came to the table and unwrapped his arm and examined the cut, with the practical attention of someone who had field-dressed wounds before and was not dramatic about it. Kael watched from the window. He watched her hands on Riker's arm, efficient and certain, and he watched Riker's face, which was looking at her with the expression of a man accounting for something precious. He felt the weight of that, and he let himself feel it, which was different from what he would have done 4 months ago. 4 months ago, he would have converted the feeling into something actionable and moved on. Now he stood at the window and felt it all the way through, the specific shape of what he'd wasted and who had inherited it, and he let the feeling be true without trying to manage it. It didn't kill him. That was something. Riker looked at him over Naira's shoulder. You brought 400 soldiers into my territory without asking, Riker said. I sent a message. I had 2 hours to decide whether to trust it. I know. Kyle held his gaze. I wouldn't have given you 2 hours. I would have come regardless. Something moved in Riker's expression. Not warmth exactly, recognition. Because of the debt, Riker said. Kale looked at Naira's back, at the line of her spine, at the braid that had come completely loose now and hung dark over one shoulder while she worked. Because of the debt, he said. Meaning, yes, and also not only that, and you know it, and I am not going to say it out loud in this room. Riker held his gaze for a moment. Then he nodded, once, the nod of a man accepting and accounting. The cleanup took until dawn. Compound fighters processed, wounded, tended. Brennan Cole secured in the fortress cells with 3 guards who had been specifically selected from soldiers who had not served under him. The Compact's eastern network, already destabilized by Castor's collapse, had lost its last operational arm in the northern territories. What remained was administrative, the kind of systematic work that Naira was already organizing from the war room table before the last fire in the outer yard had been fully extinguished. Kale found himself outside the fortress walls at some point before sunrise, standing in the pre-dawn gray, alone for the first time in what felt like days. His right hand had a cut across the knuckle he hadn't noticed during the fighting, and noticed now because the cold was in it. His shoulder was stiff. He was 31 years old and had been fighting since 16, and the debt his body was carrying from those 15 years announced itself most clearly in the small, quiet moments like this one. He thought about Brennan Cole against that wall. I wanted to be more. The particular clarity of a man who had looked at what he had and decided it wasn't sufficient, and had made a choice from that decision that had unspooled for 18 months into a conspiracy that had destabilized Pact territories, moved families off their land, and put a blade through the trust of a man who had given him 4 years of genuine reliance. He had understood the feeling. He would not say that out loud to anyone, but he understood it. The hunger for more. The sense that what you were was insufficient. The willingness to compromise the thing you'd built for something you thought you needed more. He'd done his own version of it. His version had been pride rather than greed, but the mechanism was the same. I need to be right more than I need to see clearly. And the cost was the same. Things destroyed that couldn't be rebuilt. People hurt who hadn't deserved it. The difference was what you did with the understanding afterward. Whether you let it make you smaller and more defended, or whether you let it crack you open enough to fit something true inside. He was standing there in the gray pre-dawn cold, working out what kind of man he was going to be with this understanding when he heard footsteps on the stone behind him. Nira stopped about 6 feet away and stood with her arms crossed against the cold, looking east where the sky was beginning to separate from the darkness in a thin line of pale light. "You should sleep," she said. "You're not sleeping." "I'm not done." She paused. "You are." He looked at her profile against the early light. She had mud in her hair and blood on her sleeve, and she was standing in the cold with the uprightness of someone whose body was tired and whose mind was still fully operational, and she was telling him to sleep with the same directness she'd used to tell Riker to sit down, the directness of someone who said the useful thing without calculating whether it would be well received. "I have to go back," he said. "I know. Silver Fang needs... There's work. The network dismantlement. The Eastern Pacts need direct contact from the Crown." He was saying things that were true, and also not quite the thing he was trying to say, and he heard himself doing it and stopped. She looked at him. "I'm sorry," he said. Not the version he'd been constructing for 11 days, not the managed adequate version, just the plain sentence. "I am sorry, Naira, for all of it. For the accusation and the public humiliation and not listening and all of it." He held her gaze. "I know that doesn't fix anything. I'm not saying it because I think it fixes anything." She was quiet for a moment. The light was coming up slowly in the east, gray becoming pale gold at the very edge. "I know," she said. And then, after a pause, "I heard you, what you said at the crossing. I know you meant it." He waited. "What you did tonight," she said. "You didn't do it for me." "No," he said. "I did it because it was right, and because the debt was mine, and because there were people who needed help, and I had 400 soldiers." He paused. "But I rode faster than I needed to." She looked at him. Something in her face moved, not softening exactly, not the return of something lost, something more like acknowledgement, like a woman looking at a fact and calling it what it was. "Kyle," she said, I can't go back. I told you that and I meant it. Who I was in your court, what I was willing to accept from that life. That person is gone. She had to go for me to become this." She gestured, small, at herself, at the fortress behind her, at the pale dawn coming up. "You understand that?" "Yes," he said. "And Riker..." She stopped. "What we are to each other is not something I'm going to explain or justify to you, but it's real, and I'm not I'm not asking you to justify it, he said. I'm not asking for anything. She looked at him steadily. Then what are you doing? She said. Not hostile, genuinely asking. He thought about it. He looked at the pale line of light on the eastern horizon and thought about it honestly, which was something he had not always been good at but was trying to get better at. I'm standing here, he said, in the only place I can stand, which is outside everything I broke. He paused. I think I needed you to know that I see it clearly. That I don't have a version of this where I get something back. I just needed you to know that I see it. She looked at him for a long time. The dawn was coming in properly now, the gray becoming color, the fortress walls going from black to brown to gray gold in the early light. Okay, she said, for the second time. The same word. And it meant the same thing it had meant at the river crossing. Not forgiveness, not the reopening of something closed, but the acknowledgement of a truth spoken plainly between two people who had earned the right to speak plainly to each other, whatever else was gone. She turned to go back inside. She stopped after 2 steps. The Eastern Pack Lords, she said without turning around. When you make contact, the Harrow settlement head is a woman named Grael. She's been holding that community together through 3 years of compact interference. She doesn't trust Crown authority, but she understands competence. A pause. Talk to her like she's competent. He stood very still. I will, he said. She went inside. He stood in the dawn light for a moment longer, breathing the cold air, feeling the cut across his knuckle and the stiffness in his shoulder and the specific weight of a man who had arrived, finally, at a clear view of himself. Not a comfortable view, not a flattering one, but a true one. Then the sound of shouting came from inside the fortress. Not the organized shouting of soldiers. The sharp, alarmed, something has gone wrong kind. He was through the door before the second shout finished. The war room corridor was full of running Black Wolf soldiers, and at the center of the motion was Sora, moving fast and low toward the staircase, and she turned when she heard Kale's boots, and her face had the flat white quality of someone carrying catastrophic information. Brennan Cole, she said. He's in the cells. He was in the cells. She was already moving again, and Kyle moved with her, taking the stairs at a run, his body forgetting everything it had been feeling 30 seconds ago and replacing it with the pure operational clarity of a developing crisis. He had a second man inside, someone we didn't know about. She stopped at the top of the stairs. The corridor ahead was lit by torches, and at the end of it, the door to Riker's private chambers was open. And through that open door, Kyle could hear voices. One of them Riker's, tight and controlled, and one of them Brennan Cole's. And underneath both of them, a sound that made the hair on Kyle's arms stand up. Naira's voice. Not afraid. Not calling for help. Talking. Low and steady. The voice of someone buying time. Sora looked at Kyle. He was already moving down the corridor, sword in hand, and behind him, he heard Sora pulling soldiers into position, and ahead of him, the voices behind the door continued. Naira's steady, and Brennan's increasingly frayed, and he thought with the cold clarity of a man who has reached the place where thinking and acting become the same thing. He has something on her or on Riker or both, and she is keeping him talking, and the door is 10 feet away, and what happens in the next 30 seconds is going to end this one way or another. He flattened against the wall beside the door frame. He looked back at Sora. She held up 3 fingers. 2. 1. And Kale Thornheart, King Alpha of the Silver Fang Kingdom, who had ridden 4 hours in the dark to repay a debt he could never fully repay, who had stood at dawn and said the truest thing he had ever said to another person and been given the only honest answer it deserved, who had spent 15 years building a version of himself that had turned out to be only half of what was possible. Took a breath, felt the weight of the sword in his hand and the stiffness in his shoulder and the cut across his knuckle and the full specific cost of every choice that had brought him to this corridor in this fortress in this dawn, and went through the door. The room was not large. That was the first thing Kyle registered when he came through the door. The scale of it, the smallness of the space where the last piece of this was going to resolve. A private chamber, working table, 2 windows still dark with the earliest hour of morning, a single torch in the wall bracket throwing orange light across everything. The kind of room that made big men feel the walls. Riker was standing near the far window. Not restrained, Prime. Brennan hadn't had time or manpower for that, but positioned in the specific stillness of a man who understood that moving abruptly would escalate something that hadn't finished finding its shape yet. The cut on his arm had bled through the wrapping again. His face was the face Kael had been looking at for 3 days now, measuring and controlled. But underneath the control tonight was something rawer. Not fear, Riker. Draven was not a man who feared easily, but the specific tight fury of a man who had been betrayed by someone he'd trusted completely and was holding that fury on a very short leash because the situation required it. Brennan Cole was in the center of the room. He had a knife, not a sword. He'd come through the cells without his sword, through whatever passage his inside contact had arranged, and what he had was a short blade, functional, the kind of thing a man kept in a boot because it was small enough to miss in a search. He was holding it with the grip of someone who knew how to use it, but was not, right now, primarily interested in using it. He was interested in the conversation. He needed the conversation to go somewhere that gave him an exit. Naira was between him and Riker, not because anyone had put her there, because she had placed herself there, with the specific deliberateness of a person who had assessed the geometry of the room and the geometry of the situation and concluded that the most useful thing she could do was occupy this particular piece of space. She was standing with her hands visible and her weight easy and her eyes on Brennan's face with the complete focused attention she brought to everything, reading him the way she read maps, the way she read rooms, looking for the thing underneath the surface presentation that told the true story. Kael came through the door, and Brennan's eyes snapped to him, and the knife came up slightly, and Kael stopped moving and went very still. 3 people in a room with one knife and everything that had been building for months, distilled down to whatever happened in the next 60 seconds. "Brennan," Naira said. She hadn't taken her eyes off him when Kael entered. Her voice was level and unhurried, the voice she used when she was being very careful not to introduce pressure into a system that was already at maximum. "Look at me." Brennan's eyes came back to her. He was breathing fast, not panicking yet, but close to the edge of it, the specific breathing of a man whose plan had degraded to the point where he was improvising and he knew it, and the knowing was eating at him. "There's no version of tonight where you leave this fortress with what you came for," she said. "You know that." "I came for Draven," Brennan said. His voice was rough. "I came to finish what the compact started." "The compact is finished," Kael said from the doorway, flat and certain. "Castor's network is gone. The offensive failed. Whatever they promised you for this, it's already not payable." Brennan's jaw moved. He looked at Kael with an expression that was equal parts calculation and something rawer and less manageable. The look of a man who had committed too far down a road to reverse and knew it. "Step back," Brennan said to Naira. "No," she said. Just that. Not defiant, not performing courage. Just the simple answer of a woman who had decided where she was standing and was not interested in revising it. Brennan looked at her, and Kael watched something happen in Brennan's face in that moment. Something that was not a decision exactly, more like the recognition that a particular calculation had come out wrong, that the person standing between him and his objective was not the person he'd expected to be standing there, and the wrongness of it was throwing everything else off. "You were supposed to be nothing," Brennan said. And the strange thing was that it wasn't contempt in his voice when he said it. It was something closer to bewilderment, the voice of a man confronting an outcome his model had not predicted. "When Draven brought you in, I thought, a banished mate from a rival kingdom, political theater, something to use." Nira looked at him steadily. "And then you kept being useful," Brennan said. "And then you kept being right. And then everyone around him started listening to you, and I started thinking, she's going to become the thing that makes him unbeatable. She's going to make him something I can't move around." His breathing was uneven. "So I told the Compact. I told them she was the variable that needed removing before the Northern Alliance solidified." The room was very quiet. "The Valley Draw," Naira said. Her voice had not changed. "That wasn't just to isolate Riker. It was to put me on an exposed road with 20 soldiers." "Yes." Kael's hand tightened on his sword. He did not move. Nira looked at Brennan for a long moment, and then she said something he had not expected, which was perhaps the thing she did most consistently, produced the response that the situation had not budgeted for. "I understand why you did it," she said. Brennan stared at her. "You saw something being built that would end your relevance," she said. "You couldn't compete with it directly, so you tried to remove it. That's not evil, Brennan. That's just a man who is afraid of becoming unnecessary." A pause. "You should have talked to Riker. Riker would never have—" "You don't know that," she said, "because you never tried. You went straight to destroying instead of asking." Her voice was still level, still without performance, but there was something in it now. Not anger, not pity, something more honest than either. That's the thing about fear. It makes you skip the hard conversation and go straight to the catastrophic choice. And then the catastrophic choice becomes the only true thing about you, and everything you actually were gets buried under it. Brennan looked at her. The knife in his hand had dropped 2 inches without him appearing to notice. Riker had not moved from the window. He was watching Naira with the expression Kyle had seen before. Not the look of a man watching someone perform, but the look of a man watching someone be entirely themselves, and finding that thing both remarkable and simply true. Kyle stood in the doorway and watched Brennan Cole's face change. It didn't change into surrender. It changed into something more complicated and harder to name. The expression of a man who has been seen clearly, perhaps for the first time in the process of doing something terrible, and is finding that being seen clearly is its own kind of ending. The knife came down the rest of the way. He set it on the table. He sat down on the floor. Not dramatically, just sat down, as though his legs had finished with the work of holding him up and had communicated this to the rest of him without consulting his pride first. Sora came through the door behind Kyle and took Brennan Cole into custody with the efficient quiet of someone finishing a sentence that had been started too long ago. The room exhaled. "Halt." Riker sat down on the edge of the table and pressed his unwrapped arm against his side and looked at the ceiling for a moment. It was the first time Kyle had seen him look tired, genuinely tired, not tactically depleted, but the specific exhaustion of a man who had been carrying something at high tension for hours and had just been allowed to put it down. Nira went to him. She rewrapped his arm with the clean cloth Sora's medic had left in the room, working quickly and without sentiment, and Riker led her, which Kyle had observed was what Riker did when Naira decided something needed to be done. He let her do it, not from passivity, but from the specific intelligence of a man who had learned to recognize competence and get out of its way. Kyle stood near the door and let the room settle. After a moment, Riker looked at him. "That's twice in 12 hours, he said. "I know. I don't like owing debts." "I didn't come here to collect one," Kyle said. Riker looked at him for a long moment with the measuring quality that seemed to be his resting state. Then he said, "The Northern Alliance, the Eastern Pacts, the Valley Settlements, the territory networks Naira has been building, that work goes on. With or without the compact threat, the underlying need for it doesn't change." He paused. "Silver Fang's eastern border is adjacent to 3 of the Pact territories we're trying to bring in. Your cooperation would accelerate what we're building by 6 months minimum." Kyle understood what was being offered. Not forgiveness, neither of them were dealing in that currency, but something more durable. The pragmatic extension of a hand between 2 men who had established, through the worst possible sequence of circumstances, that they could be trusted to do what they said and show up when it mattered. "I'll send a formal delegation within the month," Kyle said. "Full cooperation on the eastern border agreements. Whatever Naira's network needs from Silver Fang territory access, she'll have it." He said her name without looking at her, which was a deliberate choice, the choice of a man who was keeping his accounting clean. Riker nodded. Once. The nod of a deal made between people who would not need to write it down. Dawn came in fully by the time the fortress was secured, the compact fighters processed, the wounded tended, the structural damage assessed, the ordinary machinery of aftermath. Kyle knew this machinery well, had run it after a dozen engagements, the long grinding work of making a place functional again after violence had moved through it. He found himself in the outer courtyard as the sun came up, watching his soldiers prepare for the return ride. 400 men who had ridden north in the dark and were now in the business of riding south in the light, carrying the specific quiet of people who had done something and come through it intact. He was proud of them in the uncomplicated way he was always proud of his soldiers. Not with sentiment, but with the clean acknowledgement of people who had been where he needed them to be and had performed. He was thinking about the ride home, about the work waiting, the formal dismantlement of Castor's network, the Eastern Pack outreach, the administrative weight of a kingdom that had been running without its king for 4 days. He was thinking about what he would say to his court when he returned. Not explanations. He didn't owe his court explanations, but the thing that came after explanations, the changed posture of a man who had looked at himself clearly and was now moving differently through the space his position occupied. He was thinking about all of this when Naira came into the courtyard. She was wearing a clean jacket. Someone had found her one, the road mud and blood replaced by plain dark wool. Her hair was rebraided, tight and correct. She looked from a distance exactly like the composed and capable woman she'd been in Grayville, in the war room, on the Eastern Road. Up close, she looked like someone who had been awake for 20 hours and was running on the specific fuel of a person who had too much work left to allow themselves to be tired yet. She stopped in front of him. "You're leaving," she said. "This afternoon. My captains need the horses rested first." She nodded. She looked at the courtyard, at his soldiers, at the fortress walls with the morning light on them, and then she looked back at him with an expression that had something careful in it. Not guarded, not closed, just careful, the way you were careful with something that was real and fragile at the same time. "What Brennan said," she said, "about me being the variable that needed removing." She paused. "He wasn't wrong about the effect. The alliance work, the Eastern network. It's the most useful thing I've done, more useful than anything I did in your court." She said it plainly, without cruelty, just as a statement of fact. Because here someone looked at what I was doing and decided it mattered. "I know," Kael said. "I'm not saying that to—" "I know," he said again. Gentle this time, or as close to gentle as he could make his voice, which had not been built for gentle but was trying. "You're not saying it to hurt me. You're saying it because it's true, and we've established that we say true things to each other." He held her gaze. "I know, Nira. I knew it in Grayville when I watched you work. I knew it before that, somewhere I didn't let myself look at." She looked at him. "That's the thing about pride," he said. "It's not loud. It doesn't announce itself. It just quietly rearranges everything around you so that you're always at the center, always right, always the one whose judgment closes the question. And you don't notice you're doing it until you're standing in an empty hall, wondering where everything went." She was very still. "I ran a court for 8 years," he said, "and I was good at it, and I was wrong about the most important thing in it." He paused. "I don't know what kind of king I'm going to be from here, but I know I'm going to be a different one. Not because I want to be better, though I do, but because the old version has been costing people things they didn't agree to pay, and I'm done letting it cost them." Nira looked at him for a long time. The courtyard was going through its morning sounds around them. Horses, men, the distant machinery of a fortress resuming itself. "When you go back," she said slowly, "there are going to be people who watched you dismantle Castor's network and ride north to honor a debt they don't fully understand. They're going to tell each other a story about it, a clean story, a good king story, where you're the hero of your own correction." She paused. "Don't let them." He looked at her. "Let it be complicated," she said. "Let it stay the size it actually is. You made a catastrophic mistake. You've done the work of owning it. And you're going to spend a long time in the consequences of it. And that's what it looks like when a king actually changes. Not a clean arc, just the daily work of being different than you were." Her eyes were direct and steady. "The pack lords who lost families on those eastern roads, talk to them the way you'd want someone to talk to you if it had been your family. Not with the prepared speech, with the actual thing." "I will," he said. She nodded. They stood in the morning light in the outer courtyard of the Black Wolf Fortress, and the distance between them was the distance of everything that had happened and everything that couldn't be undone, and everything that had been built in the space that the undoable things had left behind. And it was not a comfortable distance, but it was an honest one. "Are you happy?" he asked. He hadn't planned to ask it. It came out of him the way true things sometimes came out without the management he usually applied. She considered it. Not a quick answer, not a performed one. She actually considered it, the way she considered things that deserved real thought. "Yes," she said. "Not the way I thought I would be. Not the way I wanted to be when I was 23 and thought happiness looked a particular way." She looked at the fortress behind her, at the walls and the work and the life that had built itself inside them. I'm useful here. I'm trusted here. I wake up in the morning and the work in front of me is work that matters, and the person beside me, Riker, is... She stopped, chose her words with precision. He is exactly what he appears to be. There's no gap between what he presents and what he is. Do you know how rare that is? Kale thought about his own reflection in that statement and said nothing for a moment. Yes, he said, I'm starting to understand how rare it is. She looked at him with something in her face that was not warmth exactly. It was too clear-eyed for warmth, but was its neighbor. The expression of a woman who was done being hurt by someone and had arrived, on the other side of that, at something more sustainable. Go home, Kyle, she said. Take care of your kingdom. Be the version of yourself that had to travel this far to become possible. She turned and walked back into the fortress. He stood in the courtyard and watched the doors close behind her and breathed the cold morning air and felt, for the first time in what seemed like a very long time, something that was not guilt and not regret, and not the operational pressure of the next thing that needed doing. It was something quieter than all of those, something without a clean name. He thought it might be the beginning of being at peace with the shape of what he'd done, not absolved of it, not comfortable with it, but at peace with it the way you could be at peace with a scar. It was yours. It was permanent. It told a true story about where you'd been and what you'd survived, and you could live with it without letting it be the only true thing about you. Us. Silver Fang rode south at midday. The road was cleaner in daylight. Kale rode at the head of the column as he always did, and the terrain unspooled in front of him in the matter-of-fact way of land that had no interest in the internal states of the people moving through it, which he had always found clarifying. Davin rode at his left shoulder and for the first hour said nothing and then said, "The delegation to the Eastern Pax. When do you want to move on it?" "Within the fortnight," Kyle said. "I want to go personally to the Harrow settlement first." Davin absorbed this. "Personally?" "There's a settlement head named Grael," Kyle said. "I owe her a conversation, not a delegation." "Me." Davin said nothing for a moment. Then, "Yes, my lord." They rode. 3 weeks later, Kale Thornhart sat across a rough-hewn table from a woman named Grael in a Harrow settlement hall that smelled like pine smoke and the particular damp of a building that sat near running water. She was 60, broad through the shoulders, with the hands of someone who had been doing physical work her entire life, and the eyes of someone who had been watching people for just as long and had stopped being surprised by most of what she saw. She had looked at him when he arrived, just him, with Davin and 4 soldiers, no formal trappings, no prepared court, and she had said, "You're the Silver Fang King." "Yes," he'd said, "the one whose conspiracy put 3 of my families in the ground." "Yes," he'd said, "that's why I came." She'd looked at him for a long moment, then she'd opened her door wider and said, "Sit down." They talked for 2 hours. He told her everything, Castor's network, the timeline, the specific way Silver Fang's crown blindness had allowed a private conspiracy to operate for 6 years in territory that owed those families protection. He did not use the managed language of court accountability. He used the plain language of someone describing a failure he owned. She listened the way Nira listened, all the way through, without filling the space with her own processing. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What do you want from this conversation?" "Nothing," he said. She looked at him. "I want you to know that I know," he said. "And I want to know what your settlement needs, not what I can offer in the abstract, what you actually need." She looked at him for a long time with those 60-year-old eyes that had stopped being surprised, and he saw the specific moment when she decided something. "Roads," she said, "maintained roads from the valley, crossing to the eastern trading post. We've been asking for 15 years. Every time the Crown changes its mind about whether the eastern settlements matter, the roads are the first thing that gets cut." "Done," he said. "And a standing arbitration presence, someone with actual Crown authority we can bring disputes to without riding 3 days to the capital." "Done," he said. She looked at him. "You're going to do both of those things?" "Yes." "What if I told you those things don't make up for the 3 families?" "They don't," he said. Nothing makes up for the 3 families. That's not what they're for. They're for the next 3 families. The ones who don't have to die because the roads weren't maintained and the arbitration wasn't present. He paused. The debt doesn't go away. I'm just going to stop letting it be an excuse to not do the next right thing. Grail looked at him for a long, measuring moment. Then she poured 2 cups from the pot on the fire and pushed one across the table at him, and he understood that this was the most honest diplomatic gesture anyone had made to him in 8 years of sitting at important tables. He picked up the cup. In the Black Wolf Fortress, the Northern Alliance work continued. The Eastern Pact territories came in one by one over the following months, slowly, with the suspicion of communities that had been disappointed before, but steadily, drawn by the evidence of a system that functioned, that kept its agreements, that sent people to their disputes who actually listened. Nera was at the center of it, not as a figurehead, but as a working part of the mechanism, writing correspondence, mediating between pack lords who had old grievances, identifying the specific human pressure points that made political agreements collapse, and working to relieve them before they did. She stood beside Riker when the final alliance documents were signed, in the same fortress courtyard where Brennan Cole had been taken away, and the pack lords who gathered for the signing were men and women who had been enemies 6 months before and were now, tentatively and pragmatically, something else. Riker did not make a speech. He shook hands, he signed documents. He looked at each pack lord with the direct, unglamorous attention of a man who was interested in the practical fact of what had just been agreed and not in the ceremony around it. And the pack lords, one by one, looked back at him with the expression of people who had been expecting theater and received instead something more durable. When it was done, when the last lord had signed and the courtyard had gone from formal to the looser register of people who have finished a hard thing and are beginning to believe it, Riker stood with Naira in the late afternoon light and looked at the result of what they had built. 12 packs, he said. 13, she said. Grail's settlement sent word this morning. He looked at her sideways. The Silver Fang King built them roads, she said, without particular inflection. Apparently that was sufficient. Riker was quiet for a moment. 13 packs, he said. She nodded. He put his hand on her shoulder, the left one, the one where she carried the old tension. And the tension was not entirely gone, but it was less than it had been less for months, worn down by the daily evidence of a place where being seen clearly was not an exception, but a standard. You did this, he said. We did this, she said. Naira. She looked at him. You know what I mean. She did know. She knew what he meant the way she knew most things about him, not from being told, but from paying attention over time, which was the only way you truly knew anything about another person. She knew that he was not a man who said things like this easily, that the directness he brought to everything else in his life had a different quality when it was turned toward her, more deliberate, more chosen. Yes, she said, I know. The courtyard went on around them, evening coming in over the fortress walls, the light going amber and long. Somewhere a cook fire had started, and the smell of it was coming across the yard, wood smoke and food, and the ordinary warmth of a place that was functioning and intact. Charmed. Far south in Silver Fang Keep, a king sat at his desk in the early morning and read the summary of the Northern Alliance signing that his intelligence officer had brought him the previous evening. He read it carefully. He read Naira's name in the dispatch 3 times in the context of things she had built and facilitated and made possible. And each time he read it, the feeling was the same. The specific compound of pride and loss, and the particular satisfaction of a man who knows that something he failed to protect is nonetheless being protected. He put the dispatch down. He sat for a moment in the early light, in the quiet of a study that he was trying to use differently than he had before, as a place for actual thinking rather than the performance of decision-making. He was not always successful. 15 years of habits did not dissolve in 3 weeks. But he was trying, which was the only honest place to start. He thought about Grael's cup pushed across a rough table, about a woman who had walked out of his great hall without looking back and had built something worth looking at, about the specific sensation of standing in a courtyard saying the truest thing he had ever said to another person and receiving, in return, not what he wanted, but what was real. There was a version of this story where the ending was about him, about his growth, his correction, his becoming worthy of something he'd thrown away. He could feel the pull of that version. It was a satisfying shape. It was, he suspected, the story he would have told himself 6 months ago without noticing that he was telling it. But that was not what had actually happened. What had actually happened was that a woman he had failed had refused to be destroyed by that failure, had taken what she was and built something truer than what he'd offered her, and was now doing the most important work in the Northern Territories alongside a man who saw her clearly and had never once made her earn the right to be believed. And he had played a small, real, costly part in clearing the obstacles from her path. Not as redemption, just as the minimum obligation of a man who understood what he owed. He picked up his quill. He had a letter to write to the Harrow Settlement arbitration candidate, someone Grail had recommended, a practical woman from the Valley community with 10 years of dispute mediation experience. He had a meeting with his eastern border captains in an hour. He had a kingdom to run with greater humility than before, which was not a conclusion to anything, but was the work, the daily continuing work, of trying to be the version of himself that the worst experience of his life had made possible. He was not at peace with everything. He didn't expect to be. Peace of that kind was for people who believed the past could be balanced out, and he had stopped believing that. What he had instead was the present, which was enough, which was all anyone actually had, and was only wasted when you treated it as currency for an account that had already been closed. He wrote the letter. Outside his window, Silver Fang Keep went through its morning, the sounds of a fortress waking, the practical noise of a living place, and the light that came in was the flat, clear light of a northern morning that had made no promises and would not be asked to make any. It was enough. It was the only thing that ever was.